Well, welcome to SUNY Plattsburgh. Welcome to New York. Anybody here from Vermont or Quebec? Really great to have this in person after 2 years of doing it via WebEx or Zoom or whatever virtual platform we were trying to pull this off on. We're really excited today to share with you some of the work that the Lake Champlain Fisheries and Wildlife Management Cooperative are doing. I got to say, I really feel that this cooperative and the work that they do represents one of the true collaborative success stories in fish and wildlife management. And I think you're going to hear some things today that will point evidence towards that. And we're really excited about the agenda today. We're really excited to share the things that we're doing, the things that we're learning, the successes we're having. But what we're most excited about today is having some interaction with you, the public, the angling public, to talk to us about what you see, what you feel, answer your questions, so we can all be part of managing this great resource. Before I pass it on to Director Herrick, I just want to introduce some of my New York staff. And I'm sorry, I've been in meetings all week talking, and my voice is shot. So, Rob, could you raise your hand there? Rob Ferrantino, he is our Region 5 Fisheries Manager, responsible for all Region 5, including Lake Champlain. And then we are very fortunate to have here Nicole Balk. She's our exclusive Lake Champlain biologist that we hired in 2017, and she's doing a bang-up job. She really is. And lastly, Erin, can you raise your hand? Erin Venivolrath, she is our Lake Champlain coordinator. She just came and she sits in our DEC office. So without further ado, Director Herrick.
So I'm Chris Herrick. I'm the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife from the state of Vermont. And last year, this meeting was by Zoom. And for me, I love seeing people because the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Vermont, probably in New York as well, is the one that is probably the most responsive to public input than any other state entity in state government. We truly listen to what we hear from our customers, and we look at anglers, hunters, trappers as citizen scientists. They bring us information because there's just so many of you out there doing things. I'm also happy to report today that some of the information that Vermont and New York will be sharing, the reports that I've gotten on my desk about the state of the fishery are generally good. And so I'm not going to get into the details because, one, I'm not good at that, but the folks from Vermont are. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they come up. But I can tell you I've spent time with them. Since I became commissioner, one of the things I wanted to do is get out and go out with wildlife biologists and other folks. And so I spent time on the dory out on Lake Champlain. I got put to work, in fact. Bernie's like, if you're going to be here, you're a deckhand. And I got to see the work that they do and get at least a taste of it. And every time I spend time with our folks, it's like a master class. And I get both educated and humbled by the level of professionalism and expertise that we have working at our department. And because of that, the work, the outcome that they have is fantastic. So you're going to hear about that today. But one thing I think everybody should know is Senator Leahy left. He got done after 40 some odd years. Why does that matter? Well, he was a big advocate for Lake Champlain, the fisheries, and specifically the sea lamprey control program. And we have met with Senator Welch and expressed our interest in him continuing that funding, and he understood that, and I'm hoping we won't see any lag in that. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming. Your input is as important as anything, and have a great day.
Good morning. I'm Bradley Young. I'm representing the Fish and Wildlife Service today. Our leadership is in Hadley, Massachusetts, and it was a little far for them to come today for the meeting, so they settled for me to speak on their behalf today. So I wanted to echo what Chris and Steve already said, that obviously the partnership we have here is tremendous. I've been in other states and worked in other areas, and it doesn't compare to here. The way that we're able to work seamlessly between the federal government and the 2 state governments is amazing. Never had a problem in all the years that I've worked here with that. It's the support we get from the states, and that I'm sure they would agree we provide to them, is really a great model for how the states and federal government can work together. Wanted to say that supporting the fishery, the federal government, we don't always get the notoriety or the attention. The states, well, they get the blame too, but we can avoid that. But we kind of work behind the scenes on a lot of things in both states and also in Quebec. We have a small presence in Quebec working with them internationally as the federal agency part of this branch. And it's been amazing to have the number of people that come to us and just tell us how happy they are that we've got hatcheries that are putting things in. We've got a hatchery at White River. I was going to say the other city first. I know. I was thinking the name of the city. Pittsburgh. Thank you. That's why it was escaping me. Pittsburgh. Deutsche Eisenhower Hatchery in Pittsburgh, Vermont, down near Rutland, and then White River National Fish Hatchery near Bethel, Vermont. So those are hatcheries. And then my office has the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office. We're in Essex Junction, Vermont. I do sea lamprey control. That's my branch of the office. We also have salmon restoration, native fish restoration. Kurt will be speaking about that later on. And then we also have a habitat branch who does habitat restoration, assessments, and a lot of culvert removals, making rivers and tributaries more accessible to fishes. So that's kind of what we do. And again, we're just proud to be a part of this cooperative. And I wanted to recognize our group here. I mentioned Kurt. Kurt, you want to raise your hand for our office? Native fish restoration. Then Ken is with my team, the lamprey control. And I could actually almost claim all the Vermont and New York folks as well as part-time helpers. Every fall, we depend on help from Vermont and New York in coming and participating in sea lamprey control treatments. And without their help and their staff participating, we couldn't pull it off. There's no way. So very appreciative for all the help we get from Vermont on that. And New York. Thanks.
My name's Tom Berry. I'm here today representing the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, the GLFC. GLFC works across the Great Lakes primarily on sea lamprey control and other efforts, and they've been involved since the inception of the sea lamprey control program on Lake Champlain as the primary funder and sharing technical expertise as well for sea lamprey control. Over the years, and Commissioner Herrick mentioned Senator Leahy, who I used to work for, he grew the funding to where now the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission has a very significant role on fisheries and aquatic ecosystems related to Lake Champlain, including primarily the sea lamprey control program, which is primarily funded by the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, but also now significant support to fisheries and lake research at the University of Vermont, newly stood up program at SUNY Plattsburgh at the Lake Champlain Research Institute, which you'll hear a little bit more about today, as well as funding to the Lake Champlain Basin Program, deep involvement in the work on the canal barrier that's being contemplated for invasive species in the canal. So a broad involvement primarily through funding by the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. I'm their new person on the ground to really keep an eye on what's going on in Lake Champlain and hope that we can continue to be a partner. About $10 million in 2023 is going to support the activities I just mentioned. So a lot of the work you're here today is supported by the Fisheries Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
All right, thanks everybody. My name is Margaret Murphy. I'm a fish program manager with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. So I'm going to kind of kick off an overview of some of the fisheries work we do and the cooperative itself. And then we'll have the biologists get into the details of some of the species-specific work we're doing. So the Fish and Wildlife Cooperative work under a strategic plan that's been developed through the 3 agencies as well as our cooperators. The latest draft was from 2020. And it's designed to help guide our efforts cooperatively on the lake. As you know, Lake Champlain is a pretty large lake, and with 2 states, a federal agency as well as Quebec, it's nice to try to be coordinated on it. The cooperative itself is in the US, but we do try to converse with our northern neighbors in Canada as well. As Brad mentioned, there is a Fish and Wildlife Service presence there helping with the sea lamprey control. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the strategic plan. It is available online at the Fish and Wildlife Service cooperative site. I do not have a link to that, I believe. We can get you a link to that at the end if you need it. But if you just do a search for a strategic plan for Lake Champlain Cooperative, it should pop up for you. It does outline the objectives, actions, and timelines for 3 of the focus species, Atlantic salmon, lake trout, and sea lamprey. The major goal for Atlantic salmon is to maintain a healthy population in Lake Champlain and its tributaries to support a quality recreational fishery, also serving to increase the number of wild fish in the fishery. Similarly, for lake trout, the goal is to maintain an abundant lake trout population that supports a quality recreational fishery while also striving to increase the number of wild fish in the fishery. These 2 goals are pretty similar, just 2 different species. And then for sea lamprey, kind of the opposite. The goal there is to suppress the sea lamprey population to a level that supports a robust fishery and also allows the restoration of native salmonids, lake sturgeon, and other species of concern. So briefly, just going to look at the 3 species and some of the objectives and actions we're taking to help achieve some of those goals. Again, the goal is to maintain that healthy population and also to restore a wild population. The first objective is to restore natural reproduction in the tributaries, Winooski River, the Balk River, and Saranac River, and also explore opportunities to restore in the other tributaries. But again, those 3 rivers are kind of the main ones being worked on right now. The second objective is to maintain that lake and tributary fishery by maintaining a population of Atlantic salmon in line with the productivity of the system to support a recreational fishery. I know a lot of you, we love seeing the posts about the salmon that have been caught in the lake and the rivers. So it's helping to understand what we need to do to sustain that. Actions we're taking to achieve the objectives include monitoring and assessment, planning, propagation. Again, Brad mentioned the federal hatcheries. We also have 5 hatcheries in the state. We have 1 that is focused on Lake Champlain up in Grand Isle, the Ed Weed Fish Hatchery. And then looking at applied research, which you'll hear a little bit about from Kurt Heim. Our second species, again, the goal for lake trout is to maintain an abundant lake trout population that supports a quality recreational fishery while also striving to increase the number of wild fish. Similar to Atlantic salmon, we have objectives for restoring a natural population and while maintaining the lake population. To restore natural reproduction by establishing and maintaining a population of lake trout, we're looking at least 10 year classes of wild fish produced in the lake, and which make up an increasing proportion of the fishery and the total population. Secondly, to maintain the lake population, we manage the fishery through a combination of stocked fish and wild reproduction to support that recreational fishery. Actions we're taking to achieve the objectives include monitoring and assessment, applied research, propagation, and sea lamprey control. And again, Bernie Pientka will fill you in some of the details of what we're doing for lake trout. Finally, for sea lamprey, again, the goal is to suppress populations to a level that supports a robust fishery and allows the restoration of native salmonids, lake sturgeon, and other species of concern. The main objective is to restore host species, natural reproduction, and recruitment, and maintain those host species, lake and tributary fisheries by reducing the level of impacts of sea lamprey on native species and fisheries in Lake Champlain. The actions we're taking to reduce that and suppress sea lamprey consist of traps and barriers, lampricide, monitoring and assessment to assess the effectiveness of those efforts and to detect new populations, and then applied research. Brad Young mentioned that in the beginning here. He will give you some more details on that later this morning. And the cooperative so the strategic plan focuses on those 3 species right now for the next 5 years, but we're also looking at other species. We also cooperate on a broader set of fish and wildlife species in the basin. Some of the work we're doing through that: monitoring and assessment, research, species and habitat restoration and management, invasive and nuisance species control, and outreach. The efforts also expand to our collaborators. So in addition to the 3 agencies, we collaborate with UVM, with the USGS Co-op Unit, SUNY Plattsburgh, and others. We'll provide an overview of some of these other efforts that are going on in the lake after the break. So this morning will be, the first half of the morning will be focused on the salmonids, the angler creel, and the sea lamprey control. Second half of the day, we're going to transition to some other fisheries.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Nicole Balk. I'm with the DEC. I am the Lake Champlain biologist. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about our angler surveys on Lake Champlain, specifically the 2022 angler survey. I'm presenting the data, but a lot of the hard work was done by our Creel technicians, Leah Klenn and Spirit Codley. Excuse me. Okay, so why do we do angler surveys? Basically, we want to hear from you. We want your feedback and input on the fishery, and that's very important in how we manage this fishery. We need current catch rates, harvest rates, your preferred target species, and angler opinion information on the quality of the fishery. So angler surveys can help us document changes in the lake and track trends in the fishery over time. That's their most important function. The data we collect is going to be used to inform management decisions. It'll serve as a baseline to measure management actions against, and we're going to use this information to help develop a fisheries management plan for Lake Champlain. Where can you find information? Well, on the DEC website. We've actually been really revamping the website this last few months. So the angler survey plan is available up there, and we're starting to put some of the reports as they get finalized. And there's also NetPen reports if you've been involved in the NetPen project at all. We also have business cards up front here on the table. You can email me or call me, and I'm happy to get you the information in whatever way is best for you. I will even mail you paper copies. All right, so jumping into the 2022 Open Water Angler Survey, we surveyed 12 boat launches on the New York shoreline of Lake Champlain. We surveyed from April through October, and we got 331 completed trip interviews. And I want to mention, we got 100 of those interviews were completed using catch cards. So for the anglers that helped us by completing catch cards and putting them in the drop boxes, that makes a really big difference. That's very important. So I appreciate your time in doing that. From the anglers we interviewed, there were 2,276 hours expended. They caught 6,721 fish and harvested 2,411 of them. All right, and looking at the whole lake, the most targeted species was black bass in general. We have it broken down by black bass, which could be the anglers were fishing for both smallmouth and largemouth bass, or they just didn't specify. And that's 30% smallmouth bass, 15%, and 9% largemouth. So if you add them up, that's 54% of the anglers were fishing for bass during the open water survey. There was 10% of anglers fishing for lake trout, and then 7% yellow perch, and only 4% fishing for Atlantic salmon. And then we broke the lake down into zones for the analysis. We looked at all the targets and the different sites we were surveying and found that it was pretty easy to separate anglers based on their target species. So I'll show you a blow up because that's very small. In the northern zone, it runs from Rouse's Point down to about Plattsburgh. And in this area, a lot of bass were targeted, mostly smallmouth bass. And I'll get into a little more of that in a minute. Central zone was from Peru Dock down to Port Henry. This area, this is the deeper part of the lake. A lot of anglers, again, targeting bass, but also quite a few anglers targeting lake trout and Atlantic salmon, as you might expect. And then the southern zone included Ticonderoga down to South Bay. And there was a lot more variety of target species. I was pleasantly surprised, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. All right, so in the northern zone, if we want to look at catch rates, yellow perch were definitely the most successfully caught fish up there. Some anglers were definitely targeting northern pike, and black bass angling, as I said, was quite important, with most of the focus on smallmouth bass, but also some largemouth. In the central zone, yellow perch, again, were the highest catch rate and harvest rate, but there was a few other species, and you can see black bass was still important, but there's now lake trout and Atlantic salmon showing up, and also some walleye. And then in the southern zone, yellow perch definitely not as caught as often, but they're still there, important species down in the southern zone. And then black bass was huge, and that was mostly largemouth bass. So it's interesting that we have smallmouth in the north, largemouth in the south. And then I have some other data on different species and lengths. If anyone's interested, this will be in the full report. I couldn't possibly put everything in this presentation today. But if you're interested, reach out. I'll send you that report. I'm happy to talk about it. Let's see. We also asked anglers for their opinion on a couple of things. We asked them to rate their fishing experience on the day of the interview. And about 40% of them were satisfied. The dark blue is very satisfied, light blue satisfied, gray is neutral, yellow dissatisfied, red very dissatisfied. So fortunately, only 29%? Yeah, 29% were dissatisfied. Can't make everyone happy, but I was surprised by how many people were kind of ambivalent. They didn't really care one way or another. That was interesting. And then we also asked them to rate their satisfaction with fishing on the lake for their target species for the whole year, the whole season. And for this one, it seemed more people were satisfied. It was about half of the anglers were good with their fishing for the year, and then about 20% were dissatisfied. And again, a large portion of people were kind of neutral. We also asked anglers to tell us if they had any comments or concerns about the fishery. We got a lot of good feedback from this, and the technicians really enjoy hearing what people have to say about the lake and the fishery. So this is just a short list. There's quite a few, there's hundreds of comments. But invasive species were one of the top concerns of anglers for obvious reasons. A lot of comments on bass tournaments and their potential impact to the bass population. Aquatic vegetation, weeds, the water chestnut removal. A lot of anglers said lake trout numbers were up this year, which is really good for lake trout anglers, but definitely poses a challenge for the salmon anglers when they're catching a lot of bycatch in lake trout. Atlantic salmon were not reported caught very often, nor were the rainbow smelt or walleye. That seems to be a trend so far. And so not surprisingly, we received lots of requests for stocking of Atlantic salmon and walleye, also brown trout and black bass. And now I'm going to transition, and we also did an ice fishing angler survey, and we're finishing up the 2023 one right now. We've got about a week left, maybe. So here we surveyed 4 access sites across Lake Champlain. It was in the north, we had Kings Bay, sometimes Deep Bay, and occasionally Rouse's Point. It just depended on where the ice and the anglers were. And we had Willsboro Bay and Beluga Bay were in the kind of central zone, and then South Bay represented the southern zone. So we're out there January through March, ice pending. We got 110 completed trip interviews. 20 of those were completed with catch cards, so that's a 32% return rate, which is amazing. So thank you again if you participated and gave us a catch card back. 1,277 angler hours, caught 1,005 fish, and harvested 751 of them. Excuse me. So targets, mostly yellow perch were targeted during the ice fishing survey, probably not surprising. I was surprised 20% of the anglers were targeting anything. They didn't really care what they got, they just wanted to be out ice fishing. Northern pike were another major target, and we found a lot of people targeted black crappie, mostly in the southern region. So looking at targeted catch rates in the north zone, you can see yellow perch definitely were caught and harvested fairly often, and northern pike on occasion. They were as heavily targeted. In the central zone, again, yellow perch was one of the major targets, and then in Willsboro Bay, northern pike were also targeted pretty often, and then on Beluga Bay, lake trout came in. And in the southern zone, again, a wider variety of targets. I only showed 5 here. There was probably about 10 different targets, but there were just a few anglers, a few hours, not enough to show up on this catch rate graph. Again, people were fishing quite a few for bluegill, and then the black and white crappie made up a good part of that fishery, as well as the yellow perch. But yellow perch weren't caught or harvested as often as up in the northern zones. Our opinion question for this one was, how would you rate your fishing experience today? And here it seems more of the ice anglers were dissatisfied with their fishing at the end of the day. So I'm thinking ice fishing might be a little harder. And then I wanted to ask if you guys have any feedback for us about these surveys, or if you have questions. And that's the end.
Thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Pientka. I'm a fisheries biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. I work on a lot of things on Champlain, from lake trout, salmon, walleye, perch. Done a little eel work over the years too. Today I'm going to be focusing on some of our lake trout information, that what we've been doing, what results we've seen. As you know, we've had some stocking changes recently. So this is one of our species that we've actually been doing some recent management changes for the lake. So we have some different sampling that occurs annually. We have a summer gillnet survey, which was an extension of basically an experimental period. During the experimental sea lamprey control period from the late 80s into early 90s, we were doing some lake trout gillnetting around the lake. And this is just a continuation of some of that surveying, a little scaled down a little bit, but similar areas. And we started that in 2020 with the idea of getting a good handle on the percent unclipped lake trout, i.e. wild fish. All the lake trout we stock in the lake have a fin clip. We do a rotational fin clip by year. We have that section, if my animation comes through. There we go. That for our lake trout and my sections, I apologize, my sections are a little different than Nicole's Creel sections, but we're calling them the same kind of thing. We had 3 areas of the main lake that we sampled, a north section, and then a central section, and then a southern section that we basically had a target of 100 lake trout per section to get a good handle on that percent unclipped. In addition to the lake trout, we do some fall spawning assessments. So lake trout are fall spawners. They move into areas to spawn reefs, rocky shoals, and we have 2 different types of sampling. We have a trap net that we run in Hatchery Cove up in Grand Isle. That basically it's a box of a net with a long wing that comes off. And as the fish swim in the cove, the wing diverts them into the box and they get trapped into that net. And then we have 2 sampling stations that's done with major help from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In fact, they lead it. The work in Whalen and Willsboro Bay, we do a nighttime nearshore electrofishing where we're covering those areas looking for lake trout. Now, the main purpose of that sampling is to get data. And we're data on catch rates. Our gill nets can be used for catch rates, how abundant are lake trout, kind of a relative term, as well as biological information, length, weight, growth, lamprey wounds. And then we take that biological information and we tie it into the indicators. Margaret mentioned the strategic plan. We have developed an indicators, which is basically looking at different measures, and I'm going to talk about them a little later here, where they end up saying, what's the fishery look like? How are things looking at for these measures to give us kind of a scorecard, a snapshot of what's going on. So we're going to kind of dive right into the data. I have 3 years of data presented here from that trap or from the gill netting. So this is midsummer gill netting at these areas. And this is catch rate. It's lake trout per 24-hour set. And we can see that we have some variability across the years. We also have some variability, as you guys know, I mean, in the lake. The northern part of that area, we don't see as many lake trout caught. There's a big push, that southern area, Converse Bay, Split Rock, Whalen Bay, down that area that are really fairly heavy in lake trout. And we can see that in our catch numbers, they're higher. So we see that over these stations across the years, there is some variability in the nets, pretty typical that we see. Some nets will catch a few fish, some will catch a little more, and that's what's creating those error bars being a little wider in there. Now, that's the current data we have in there, but let's pull together some of the historical data to kind of say what's going on. We know lake trout abundance is a big question. We hear about it all the time of where are we? We're catching a lot of lake trout. Are there a lot more, less? So in the magenta kind of pinkish bar is kind of a broad summary of some of that older data. And yes, our catch rates are up some, but there is still a lot of variability around those catch rates over the time that we've been looking at it. So more to come, but we have done, again, I'm going to show some of the changes that were done in the management is a response to some of this information as well as some of our wild. Some of that biological information includes length frequency, size distribution of the population. So here's graphing on the bottom bar is the length ranging from about 12, 13 inches all the way to 33 inches, and we get in there. So the bars represent a percentage of the catch. The black being our clipped fish, and the red bars representing the unclipped, those wild fish. So the key thing we want to take from this picture is that we're seeing these unclipped fish in a lot of sizes. There's not just one event that went on, something went on. We're seeing them scattered through this group of sizing. Also want to point out, this summer sampling allows us to catch a broad range of the population, a broad range of the size. And you can see we have some of these smaller fish in there, 12, 13, 14, all the way up. We're going to see a different length frequency when we talk about some of the fall spawning assessment. And if we take, I pulled 2 years of data here. I can't get much more than that on a graph really easily to show. We have the 2021 data on there as well as the 2022 for those length distributions. And again, broad range of fish. We're seeing those unclipped fish, those wild fish in many different sizes in that grouping, as well as small and then fish all the way up to that 32, 33 inches. In addition to the physical information, we're removing the maxillary, the jaw, the lower bone of the jaw from the lake trout. And we're actually doing an aging. Similar to like a tree, putting down tree rings on that, fish do that as well. Multiple structures can be examined for those rings. So here's some photo examples of cross sections. So we take that jawbone, clean it up a little bit, and do a thin cross section, shine light through it, and we're able to age it. This is kind of our age distribution. We're seeing fish all the way out to 17, 16, 17, 18, 20 years old. There's some odd fish that UVM's encountered that have been like close to 30. So a lot to figure out on this one, but the growth, we see a good trend. They plateau off. That's pretty typical of fish. We see a rapid growth from them being small to a point where they level off. Still need to tease apart a little bit. If I look at some of the age one fish, I think we have some stocking issues there. Our fish coming from the hatchery are already a year and a little bit old. So I have to tease apart some of that a little bit closer. But overall, that trend and that growth we see is pretty good. We're seeing those populations living older year classes out there. Now, I have stole a bunch of the master angler photos. As you'll see a bunch of this stuff, I tried to liven it up a little bit. I love data, I love graphs, but I also like pictures. Vermont has a master angler program where you can submit your catch information. There's certain size limits and photos are submitted on there. So all these photos that we see are clippings from that master angler program just to kind of keep it exciting. So our fall lake trout assessment. We're doing, again, 2 assessments. We do a trap netting at Hatchery Cove. You can see on the photo to the right there, we have the boat. The trap, the box itself, the bag of the net is actually on the boat. You can kind of see wings coming off in the water, showing that it goes out through there. The center photo is actually an underwater photo of what the lake trout are in that trap, in the holding area. And we'll basically go through and process them on shore. It's kind of nice because in this case, Hatchery Cove is right there. We take a load of fish, go right to the shore. It's always nice to work on flat ground to get good weights and lengths and be able to have a big crew to handle a number of fish. And again, we're focusing on that data, biological, as well as it'll tie into our indicators. Now, if we bring that length frequency distribution, the size distribution that we saw in our spawning survey, well, right off the bat, we can see we don't have the small fish. These fish are old enough, they're sexually mature, they're in there for a purpose of spawning. We're not going to see those 15-inch fish. They're just not really that common. They're not sexually mature. They're not part of that population. So again, nice broad range. We have a peak in there around 27, about 28 inches. And if we pull together some of the past data from the 2021, again, fairly similar. We're seeing these length frequencies not really change. The data, the fish are consistent in the population. One of the factors, and I mentioned it already, is this unclipped rate. So the indicators have this general, and I'll get a little bit more detail of it, fish of a certain size, below a certain threshold, and fish representing from a certain fin clip. So we're representing a fin clip marking our 4- and 5-year-old fish. We'll evaluate that to say how many are unclipped in that percentage. And we can see I have graphed out all these years over time. Our indicators started about in 2011 was our indicators period. And we go through and you can kind of see, well, for years, that percent unclipped just stayed fairly stable, under around 5%. 5%, less than 5% is really considered like a clipping error at the hatchery. You're clipping thousands of fish, you're going through them. Maybe the clip wasn't big enough, it's a small remnant or something like that. So once we start seeing those 3, 4, 5%, that's not really something's going on. It's that could be from the hatchery, it could be from the action. But towards the end, we're kind of going up there. We're seeing that rise in there. We're seeing it kind of start becoming a little more obvious that something's going on. So if we take that biological data and we take these and plug them into our indicators, what our indicators did was establish a period, a reference period. And the red box kind of represents the time period on the graph, where we're looking at 2011 to 2017 to say, okay, here's a snapshot of this period. We think it was a good period. We were having some success. We had good comments from people, from anglers. Things were going well. So we took that as kind of our reference period. We looked at that and we ended up creating these threshold ranges, kind of like between the green and the magenta line. We want these values to be between these brackets. And that's kind of our target. And if something's outside that bracket, we're going to watch it. We may not react on it once or twice, but as it starts occurring a little more, we're saying something needs to be done and we need to take an action. And we use that indicators to develop a scorecard with a green circle representing within that target. We have some errors or arrows, a yellow arrow for either being above that threshold or below that threshold range, and then a red representing being outside the range for 3 consecutive years. So for our lake trout, these are our indicators for these species. They include information from the LCI Father's Day Derby. They include information from our fall assessment. They include lamprey wounding. I'm not going to talk about lamprey wounding. Brad's got a whole talk about that, so I'll keep you in suspense on what that one turns out to be. And then median weight of lake trout for the LCI Derby, and then our proportion of unclipped fish. So if we take that scorecard and kind of lay it out, this is a clipping of some of those scorecards to give you an idea of what we're generating with some of that information. We can see I put up here the last 3 years. Remember, we have that red being 3 consecutive years. So it's good to keep things always presenting at 3 years. So we can see that for most of these measures, 2020, we were all green. 2021, all green. 2022, we started to get some different errors. LCI data is showing some things outside that. I will say that the number of fish submitted overall from LCI was really, really low this year. We remember the weather. We had a lot of high wind events that weekend. And I think that just kept people from being able to get onto the water to fish these open water areas. Both salmon, lake trout were submitted in very low numbers. And kind of the last one to kind of talk about is this proportion of unclipped fish. It's a little different than that range. we kind of established some thresholds in here that basically I'd call them kind of action items. At a certain point, we need to make an action. In this case, we had an action at 15% unclipped, should result in a 25% stocking reduction. And then we had a 25% unclipped, should result in a 50% stocking reduction. And again, these would be stocking reductions from our original numbers in that reference period of 82,000 lake trout. So what does that mean? Well, we looked at those stocking, I'll go back to this one here. That 2021, we're right at that 15. We had some other factors that went involved in that, but we were right at that threshold, so we actually did a stocking reduction that year. Understand that there's a little time lag into stocking reductions. Fish are in the cycle, in the culture system. We can't just say tomorrow they're gone. It's kind of like, okay, we make a decision and it may be a year for it to enact. And so that's where we are. And then this past year, 2022, we exceeded that 25%. So we applied another stocking reduction. Now, to get an idea of how those stocking reductions played out into what went into the system, along the bottom of the graph, I have stocking year, what year they're supposed to be going out. And we can see for all those years, we were targeting 82,000, but we have some ups and downs. It's hatchery production. We do our best to meet target, and we're meeting target, but there's often a little surplus put into the production so that we're sure we're going to meet target at the end of the season when they go out into the water. So we kicked in that first stocking reduction, basically a 33% reduction in 2022. It was also a reduction in the stocking for 2023. So those fish have already gone out, and we've had that first reduction of that 33%. And then that kind of that black line and shifting to that other color at the end is basically what our goal will be in 2024. So another reduction in stocking, basically down to about 41,000. So we're taking that information we collect on those unclipped percentage and the growth and that information, and we are making these changes in response to what that system, what we're seeing in the system. So I think lake trout are one of those interesting ones where we're actually pretty actively managing it from our standpoint. And where do we see us going in 2023? Well, we're going to be doing potentially working with UVM again on possibly some juvenile work on lake trout. Just confirming those fish very early in their history, the 1-year-old and 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, that their wild proportion is appearing there, that we're seeing wild fish. We're going to continue with the summer gill netting. We're going to be doing our fall assessment. We're now having some discussions about tagging, a possible tagging study, and we may be reaching out to anglers, depending on the type of tag we use, to try to get some additional tag return. And now with our stocking rate changing, we got to rethink some of our indicators related to our stocking, the unclipped proportion. So we're having discussions now about developing a new or adjusting a new evaluation for that wild production so that we're still actively managing, making the changes as we need to keep the resource going and still meet the fishing objectives that Margaret talked about, as well as protecting some of the resources and kind of divvying up this fish species.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kurt. That's me.
I'm with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'll be talking about Atlantic salmon management and some of the data that we've collected. I'd also like to say that my supervisor, Laurie Earley, she's the head of our fish assessment program, fish assessment and restoration program. She'd love to be here, but she got a stomach bug. So for our sake, she decided not to come. So I'll just jump right into what I have for today. We know that salmon used to be quite abundant in at least 10 tributaries to Lake Champlain. Some of those shown here. We know that from historical documents, such as this one, that say the passage of a wagon might be impeded by the numbers of salmon in the stream. And that was written in reference to the Saranac River right here in Plattsburgh. And, you know, reading that makes me wish I could time travel and bring my 7-weight fly rod with me to experience what that would have been like. But unfortunately, salmon were completely extirpated from Lake Champlain by the early 1800s. Not surprisingly, due to dams, habitat destruction, as well as overharvest. at that number and abundance, they were quite easy to harvest. So as Margaret mentioned, we'll fast forward 200 years from the extirpation. We have this formation of this cooperative, and we have specific goals for salmon. That's to both maintain a recreational fishery while striving to increase the number of wild fish in the fishery. And so the actions that we do related to these goals include stocking fish, sea lamprey control, and again, I won't steal the thunder on that. Brad has a lot to say. We do assessments, and those assessments are really geared towards improving what we do. So we can do assessments to understand which of our hatchery stocking methods or brood stocks are working, so we can continue to improve the outcome of those of our hatchery systems. And then in terms of restoring natural reproduction, we do spawning surveys. We do a variety of applied research projects to understand bottlenecks to natural recruitment and ways to overcome those. And our office does habitat restoration as well as fish passage work. So those are the activities that keep us busy with regards to salmon. So I'll jump into some information on stocking. It's one of the main things we do. And we have a 304,000 smolt equivalent target for salmon. So a smolt equivalent is, not surprisingly, one smolt counts as one smolt equivalent. But we also stock fry. Fry are stocked at about 1 inch long. They're unfed. They spawned in the fall. They're stocked the following spring. So in our tallying up our numbers, if we're stocking 20 fry, that counts as one smolt equivalent. And so our quota or target has been 304,000 for quite some time. And this is how we did in 2022. So we stocked 312,000 smolt equivalents. That dotted line there shows the target of 304,000. And just like Bernie said with lake trout, we do a pretty good job at getting close to our target. Some years we go a little bit over, some years we're a little under, and that's just the nature of growing animals in a hatchery system. We also have a target size for the smolts that we stock. We shoot for stocking 90% of our smolts at a size greater than 150 millimeters, or about 6 inches. And we do this because we know that smolt size is correlated with survival, predator avoidance, and generally the fish do a little better and have a better chance of surviving in the wild if they're stocked at a larger size. And this is also a threshold size at which par, which are young salmon, will undergo the physiological changes that allow them to turn into a smolt, which prepares them for migration from where they're stocked in the river to reach Lake Champlain. And so this is the data for 2022. We do smolt assessments of all of the smolts that go out. These are subsamples of the smolts to measure the size, and we had 96% of them in 2022 were above that 150 millimeter threshold size. So to summarize the last two slides, in 2022, we stocked above average number of fish and above average size of smolts in comparison to previous years and our targets. But I want to highlight the two different kind of hatchery systems that are producing salmon. Half of the salmon that are stocked are coming from Ed Weed Fish Culture Station. The locations that they target are shown in this table here. And I'll note that all Ed Weed fish are marked with a rotational fin clip, just like lake trout. Any smolt that's coming from Ed Weed will have a mark fin clip. And they're stocked both directly into Lake Champlain, sometimes by putting a hatchery truck on a ferry and stocking the fish off the back of the ferry, as well as being stocked directly into rivers. But I want to highlight some research that was conducted at the Fish Culture Station that really was a great example of an adaptive research study to really guide stocking decisions. So they had two different brood stocks that they could use to produce smolts. The first was a feral brood stock, and that's going and collecting fish from the wild and bringing them back to the hatchery to use to produce the next generation. So that's a feral broodstock program. They also have a captive broodstock, which was held at Bald Hill Fish Culture Station. And they did a long-term study by releasing smolts each year, half and half from these two broodstocks, and then asked, well, who's producing the most returning adults that we see in the fishery and returning to rivers and our trapping stations. And so they found that the feral fish produced 250% greater returns, and that was consistent across years. So in each year, the feral broodstock origin, those smolts came back at a much higher rate than the captive broodstock. And so as a result, Ed Weed now maximizes the use of their feral fish in their broodstock production. Just an example of really learning by doing. So we're stocking all these fish, and this is a great example of how you can develop studies that allow you to determine which of your stocking practices are working the best, so then you can improve as you stock into the future. And just for folks who are interested in what they're catching out there, any salmon with a fin clip will be from Ed Weed starting in 2022. All of the fish produced at the other hatchery system will be released without the fin clip. So if you catch a fish with a fin clip or a salmon with a fin clip, it's Ed Weed, and which fin is clipped will allow you to determine the age of the fish. So for example, the fish being stocked this spring are all going to be adipose fin clipped. The fish stocked last spring were all right ventral fin clipped. So that's really useful for assessments because we don't have to go in and look at the otoliths of the fish. We can just look at the clip to determine how old they are. So the other half of fish are salmon that are stocked or produced at Fish and Wildlife Service hatcheries, kind of in collaboration with the Adirondack DEC hatchery. Our target numbers are shown here. And White River National Fish Hatchery in Bethel works to house two experimental broodstocks. One is a broodstock that was developed to be tolerant to low thiamine conditions. Thiamine deficiency is a major bottleneck to natural reproduction in the lake. I could talk for an hour about that. But so we're doing an active comparison of two different broodstocks now. One that is developed to have tolerance and one that we maintain high levels of genetic diversity in. Eggs are produced at White River and shipped to Dwight D. Eisenhower to be grown to smolts. They grow a target of 147,000 smolts each year. And a similar adaptive management experiment took place several years ago where they were testing different temperature regimes in their raceways. And they found that using a more natural temperature profile in their hatchery raceways that mimicked what a smolt would be experiencing in the wild produced higher return rates for those fish once released. So they were experiencing the cold as well as the warm temperatures, and that helped to cue them and prepare them for smoltification once being released. And so now, after that was done, all the smolts produced at Eisenhower are grown with this natural temperature regime. And then we work with the Adirondack hatchery, who we send eggs over from White River to Adirondack. And these are incubated over the winter and distributed as fry. So we have a target of 210,000 Atlantic salmon that are stocked as fry in the spring. And these are bagged up into plastic baggies filled with oxygen, and we hike out all over the Adirondacks to release these fry. And one thing I will highlight again is that these fish will have no external marks on them. And however, they are actually marked according to different experimental release groups using a new marking approach that we've implemented over the last several years. That's called parentage-based tagging. It's kind of mind-boggling, actually, but it allows us to differentially mark 18 experimental groups of fish. So we're marking 500,000 fish, and we never even touch the fish. And it's all done through keeping track of who the parents are of the different release groups. So as we're spawning fish at the hatchery, we're stripping eggs from a female, and we're taking a genetic sample of that female. And then as a male is used to fertilize those eggs, we're also taking a genetic sample of that male. So we store those samples on a sheet that looks like this. But basically, we now know who the parents are of every family of fish created in the hatchery. And by carefully organizing those families into different release groups, we can track them. And if they're caught again, we can tell which release group they're in by asking who their parents are through genetic parentage assignments. So it's still mind-boggling, but it was developed on the West Coast as a way to mass mark fish without the need for pit tagging, coated wire tagging, or external fin clips. So it's one nice thing too is we don't have to cut any of the fish that are being released. We don't have to cut any of their fins off to tag them. And so this, like I said, we have these fish are swimming around in Lake Champlain right now. There's 18 different release groups that are out there, and we're testing stocking fry and smolts. We're testing the 2 experimental brood stocks, and we're also testing a variety of different stocking locations. And ultimately, as these fish are caught in the fishery, show up in our assessments and return as adults, we're able to determine which of those 18 experimental strategies is working best to produce fish. And so just to highlight one of the studies that we're doing using parentage-based tagging, we're doing a net pen study where we're using net pens to hopefully imprint and increase the survival of smolts. And that's being compared to the traditional stocking approach where the fish are being released right into the river. So we have some initial results from that, but this next fall we'll get more data, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some initial results, or Nicole can, at the next State of the Lake meeting. But that's just one of several studies that we're kind of actively using this tagging approach to test different strategies. So I'll transition now into some spawning run assessments from 2022. Like lake trout, we have a variety of different annual sampling events that we do to keep track of how many fish are coming back. With salmon, these are returning to rivers or returning to Hatchery Brook at the Edweed Fish Culture Station, allowing us to get a gauge on what the population size is. So if we go to the Hatchery Brook trap, this is the long-term data set for Hatchery Brook. And in 2022, we had 418 salmon, which is slightly above the long-term mean of 358. And if we go to the Lamoille River, where Vermont does annual boat electroshocking, they had a really good year. They caught nearly double the long-term mean with 136 fish sampled in the river during their electrofishing surveys. And I also have talked to a lot of anglers who also will say that fishing on the Lamoille was pretty good this year. Some of our staff at our office are among those anglers who are finishing work, sampling salmon all day, and then driving immediately to the Lamoille River to go fishing. And the Winooski River, where we monitor fish at a mechanical fish lift, also had a very good year for fall returns. This was the 4th highest on record since 1993 when this started, with 128, quite a bit higher than the long-term mean. And just for, I think this would be interesting, I put these time series together. So I standardized them so you can just see the trend. They're centered now at 0 being the long-term average for each time series. And there is some consistency across these data where if you're getting low numbers of fish at the hatchery, it's also very likely that that's a low year at the rivers as well. And the coherence or a correlation between these range from 0.45 to 0.46. We're also doing some netting in New York. You may have seen me swimming around in the river with a gill net, trying to catch fish in the Saranac. But we're developing similar ways to enumerate fish in these 3 tributaries in New York to eventually develop annual abundance indices. Right now, we're still figuring out how to catch the fish in order to develop these long-term methods. But at the Saranac, we caught the exact same number of fish this year as we did last year. Very close on the Bouquet with 58. And we had a hard time catching fish on the Au Sable. And that doesn't necessarily reflect a low run. It more likely represents us having a hard time catching fish in the Au Sable. And so I'll kind of conclude with some pictures and information on fish size. So we got our hands on a lot of salmon this fall, combined our work in New York and Vermont's trapping. And there were really some big fish caught this year, a couple over 30 inches, just some impressive salmon specimens. And if you look at the length frequency distribution of all the adult salmon returning in our spawning surveys, you could really see three kind of groups emerge in this distribution, where you have lake age 0 fish. So these are smolts that were released in the spring, most likely precocious males that are maturing and ready to come back and spawn. The bulk of fish are lake age 1 fish, having spent 1 year in the lake and returning. And then these are the big ones that have spent 2 or more years within Lake Champlain before returning to spawn. And if you look at where these are caught, these over 25-inch fish range from about 10% to 28% of the total number of fish coming back to the rivers. Highest proportion of over 25-inch fish was in the Muskellunge. And if you look at over 30-inch fish, these are exceptionally rare in the population, although they do exist, but they account for less than 1% of the total run coming back to the rivers. So I could talk for a long time about salmon, but I do need to stop. We're doing a lot of work to continue to evaluate our different stocking approaches using this genetic tagging method. I hope to be able to provide some results on that. I'm gearing up for a radio telemetry study right now, tagging 150 fish with radio transmitters to be released in the Winooski River in 2 weeks to track smolt survival. Continuing for another year of that study. And we're hopeful for this summer and fall, after hearing really good reports from some folks on their salmon catches recently in the last couple weeks and during the winter. But lastly, I'll just put in a plug for if anyone is regularly catching salmon anywhere in Lake Champlain, getting a genetic sample from these fish can be really helpful for the study and assessment that we're doing. With either a fin clip or a scale sample, I can use the genetic method to determine which of the 18 release groups it's from. I could tell you if it was a fry, stocked as a fry, in what year and what river. And so if we have enough of this information, we can really get a handle on how fry stocking is contributing to the population, how the different locations that we're stocking might be working better than others. And the more data that we get on this, the better our inferences will be, and we'll have more information to make better decisions moving forward. So I will leave my contact information up here. Please contact me if you have any questions about salmon, or if you would like to participate in collecting scale samples or fin samples for me.
All right, so with all that lead up here, I guess Bernie and Kurt's there. All my thunder that's coming, they didn't want to steal. I guess I better stand and deliver here. This first picture here is my group. These are the guys that work on sea lamprey control. This is a year-old picture. I've got some new folks now, but that's about the size, the number of people that we have working on sea lamprey control year-round. Then, as I mentioned before, both states help us out in the fall, and that number is probably triple once we have the both states helping us out for treatments. Just a little bit of perspective here on things that we do with lamprey control. Obviously, we're known for lamprey control here. That's what I'm talking about today mostly. But we actually do lamprey control also in the Finger Lakes. And we work with the folks out there in a different region of New York to work on their sea lamprey control on Pientka, Seneca, and Cayuga Lakes. And also going to mention that in 2021, we were honored to be asked to go out and fill in for the Great Lakes program. During COVID, the Canadians who usually do lamprey control on the New York side of Lake Ontario weren't able to cross the border. So we got kind of called up from the farm club and got to go to the big leagues and go to the Great Lakes. And we were able to do 4 big treatments over on Lake Ontario. It was kind of an honor for us to be asked to be in that role. All right, so you don't have to read everything on here, but just kind of give you an example of where we do things on Lake Champlain for lamprey control. You can see the red up there is where we do treatments. That's what we're most known for, is applying chemical to the rivers. You can see the yellow ones are also chemical. That's 2 kinds of chemical at once, rather than just one. And then you can see the blue are where we do trapping. Those are rivers where they're small enough that we can use traps rather than chemicals to effectively control the population. We catch the adults before they have a chance to spawn, so they are no longer reproducing in those rivers. And then the purple, we do trapping and treatments. We trap what we can, but often we're not able to get everything. So depending on how we do with trapping, we'll go back in and do a treatment contingent upon surveys that tell us what the population remaining in there is. And then finally, the green are deltas. So there are, I think there's 6 on here, deltas that we have listed. They can change. We do assessments on these to find out where and when they're populated with lamprey. That drives our decision on when to treat these. And you can see that as of now, all the lamprey on deltas are in New York. And that's a real easy thing to explain. If you just think of the geology, the rivers in New York come down off the Adirondacks and they empty into Lake Champlain pretty quickly. There's not a lot of sediment area at the mouths of the New York rivers for the lamprey to fall out and rear in the lower areas of the river. Whereas in Vermont, most of the Vermont rivers tend to come off the fall line of the mountains much earlier, and there's lots of sediment area for the lamprey to reside, and they typically don't make it out to the delta areas on the lake. Looking here, just wanted to show you what it looks like for a lampricide treatment. This is the Saranac River. You see that big white hose there. I don't have it on the shore, but on the shore there's a little tent set up, and it's got a mixing vat. It's got a bunch of expensive pumps and metering gauges and tubes and wires, and it's pretty complicated. I see several folks here who do that with me on the fall. And from that, we put out a very specific and monitored concentration of lampricide pushed through that hose that gets distributed across the length of the river so that we get the chemical equally spaced in the river and mixed quickly so that it don't get hot spots on the right or the left or the center. We want to have that happen quickly, especially in the Saranac. We start at Imperial. Looking right here, this is that first little parking lot downstream of Imperial. Imperial is not more than a couple hundred yards upstream of where this hose is right now. So it's a short river as far as lamprey treatments go. We need to get the chemical in the river and mixed quickly. So that's how we apply the chemical. On the lake, when we do deltas, I mentioned those green areas. We have a really nice fancy boat that does this. We joke about years ago, we actually had airplane applications. They would crop dust and come bring them in. That was a disaster, and thank goodness they don't do that anymore. It's actually prohibited. It's not even allowed anymore. And then more recently, we had a pontoon boat with a salt spreader that you see in parking lots taking care of the ice. Well, instead of salt, we put in lampricide chemical, and we spread it across the delta that way. It worked, but it wasn't the greatest. This new boat is fantastic. This is high technology. If you've seen the modern ag equipment that sprays fertilizer or pesticides onto row crops, they have their tractors with a spread like that on the back. It's the exact same thing. We're using agricultural technology. On the boat, we have what we call the Death Star computer. If you know Star Wars, when Luke's trying to put the torpedoes down the hole, we can use that to kind of steer and make sure we stay on track and do perfect lines back and forth on the lake and apply the chemical where it needs to go. So technology has been a big part of advancing the program and allowing us to make improvements. When we do treat, I showed that picture earlier, and I'm going to show it again here in a second, of how we treat the basin. We do it in cycles, and people always ask me, well, if things are going pretty good and you only put in chemical in each river once every 4 years, why don't you just put it in every year? And I get that a lot. And I understand the reasoning behind it, and that's where I have a chance to explain the biology a little bit. When we put the chemical in, we're killing 4 year classes of lamprey all at one time. So you can see up on the top, those 2 upper pictures, when we're walking around in the river after a treatment, that's the level of dead lamprey we often see in certain areas. We'll get lots of the larvae, the babies, if you will, in the rivers that live in the sediment. And the bottom big picture shows you 4 year classes of lamprey. That was the same day on the Ausable River. I picked those up and arranged them to show the year classes. So by killing 4 year classes at one time, we only need to treat once every 4 years. The poor lamprey that are born the year after a treatment think things are great. They're going for first year, the second year, the third year, and they've almost made it. And then we come in and whack them, and then it's all over. So we get the 4 year olds, 3 year olds, 2 year olds, and 1 year olds all in one fell swoop. So when we do the treatments, we used to do them in a different way. It was It wasn't purposefully random. It was kind of an artifact of how the program grew. But you can see here, it's kind of going around. We have a counterclockwise rotation of how we treat. And this is where things go in the basin. We just move it around each year. So every 4 years, we create a cycle. But during those 4 years, we only treat 3 times. So you saw I had an off year in there. There's always one off year. One year I told folks we weren't treating this year, and they almost had a heart attack. It's like, why aren't you treating? They're going to go. No, it's okay. We got it covered. We're getting them all. It's on a cycle. We know where they all are. When I mentioned they were random in the past, you can see on the right, and again, you don't need to read all this, but look for the pattern. In the red is how things used to be. The years are on top, so 2010 through 16. You can see it was just kind of a random mishmash. And then we worked with the state regulatory agencies, not the fisheries folks, but the permitting folks, and said, look, can we change the timing on these and get them in order? And it took a lot of convincing and time, but we did. And you can see now in the green, where we are now, things line up in an order. That may just look like silly letters to you and all, but what that means is when we send out a group of 30 people now with 15 trucks, 6 trailers, 4 boats, 2,000 tons of chemical and everything else, we can go to one region of the lake and park it and make that our home base and stay there and kind of operate out of a single area. And the amount of savings on staff time and staff resources and travel and hotels and things of that sort is enormous. So it's a huge cost savings. It's an efficiency that really comes out. So that's been a big savings for the program. And just to kind of show where we are, we've had one full complete cycle now. We kind of started that in 2017 or 18. We've gone around now. 22 was our last treatment cycle, our last year of the first 4-year cycle. So we've completed one cycle, and it's kind of hard to say anything about it yet, other than we certainly know it's economically a big savings. We also think there could be a pheromone advantage. I've spoken in the past, maybe some of you may have heard it, about the fact that adult lamprey key in on the larval lamprey when they come back to spawn. So there's an odor or a pheromone that the larval lamprey living in the streams emit that kind of balloons out, fans out in the lake. And the adults sense that, they can smell it, and they follow it back into the river. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is a fantastic life history strategy. What it means is the lamprey, it probably doesn't think this way, but it ends up working to their advantage, find out that, oh, there's already larvae in here. They've made it. Somebody's already successfully spawned in this river before me. I guess it's a good place to spawn. I'll go in there and spawn too. So it kind of is a signal that it's good habitat. It's worth going in and spawning there. That's why they go in. What we're thinking is by having these things in these regional areas now, we're creating kind of plumes in regionalized areas of the lake. And what we end up doing is drawing the population of lamprey, adult lamprey, going to spawn to the different areas of the lake. And in the past, where we were trying to play whack-a-mole and hit one over here and hit one down there and hit one over there, now we're pushing the population as a whole into different regions of the lake. Is it really going to work? 50-50. I'm not really sure. It's kind of the jury's still out. We're going to have at least another 4 years of data on that to be able to get any kind of measurement on it. But there's biological sound theory behind it. And we're hoping that by doing that, we're going to increase even more our effort. What it basically does, I should kind of summarize that, we're concentrating the bulk of the population into the rivers that we're treating that year. So the reproductive effort that they're expending in the rivers where they're spawning, we're hitting. So it ends up being a more efficient use of our chemical and time to have them concentrated in that way. All right, here's my thunder. I've been doing this for 18 years, and this is the first time in 18 years that I can stand up here and say we met our targets. And I couldn't be happier. So you see 2022, that's data from last fall, November. And we've never had both lake trout and Atlantic salmon below our management targets. I know somebody's going to tell me, wait a minute, I still got a lot of lamprey out there. Yes, this is a lake-wide conglomerate measure. Certain parts of the lake tend to have more, certain parts of the lake tend to have fewer. This, though, takes all that together, and we've been using the same measure to calculate these values for even more than these number of years, 30 years. So we have data that's comparable, and we can look at this. And what it tells us is we definitely have a trend of going down here. The salmon have been going down and staying down fairly low, you can see, since about 2010 or so. They were much higher. Lake trout were a disaster in 2006. They've come down, but we've had some weird spikes that I'll honestly say we don't understand. I could give some possible explanations, but I have no real confidence in whether they're right or not. The good news is when it's going lower, it's good. And having it down that low, where we've never had it below, is certainly good. There were times when we had discussions among ourselves in the cooperative where we kind of scratched our heads and asked, are these goals even reasonable? Are we going to ever be able to get there? Have we kind of misestimated what we thought is possible? And I think the answer is no. And I'll say personally, I'm not even satisfied with that. I think we can even still do better. And I'm going to continue talking and show you some of the ways that we're planning on doing better. So one way is that measure I just showed with the graph is using wounding rates. That's where Bernie showed earlier in the fall. Fish are collected both in trap nets and electrofishing, and the fish are examined. And you find out how many lamprey wounds appear on the fish. And we do counts to figure out how many lamprey wounds are on or per 100 fish. And that's our number. The problem with that is it's an index value, and I've used this example many times. It's like the wind chill factor. It's not a real number, it's how bad the lamprey problem feels. So it depends on both the number of host species, so the number of lake trout and salmon affect the number of wounds you see. If you have very few salmon, you may have a lot more lamprey wounds. If you have a lot of salmon, you may have fewer lamprey wounds. So it's all kind of related, and those numbers may not reflect exactly the lamprey population itself as it goes up and down. What we're doing is trying to get that number now, and we're doing adult assessment. We're kind of copying the Great Lakes in this, and what we're able to do with adult assessment is do some actual quantitative trapping. So those blue rivers up there, blue and purple, I guess, are rivers that we're now doing quantitative trapping, where we collect sea lamprey during the spring when they're trying to spawn. We get them in traps, we take them out, we put a fin clip in them, then we drive them back down to the mouth, throw them back in and say, try again. And then we see if they come back. So we get a certain proportion of them to come back, and then we compare the number of ones that are clipped to the number of new ones that are in the trap at the same time. And through a lot of fancy math, we're able to then estimate the population of the river and be able to tell you about how many adults are entering that river. And from that, we can get an actual direct measure of the number of sea lamprey rather than the indirect index value. Also, these blue ones that are flashing are ones that I've told my team I want them to get their act together and get in there and trap those. They're a lot harder, so we're still working on that. They told me we'll get to that. But we're hoping to get those included as well, because the bulk of the population are found in a lot of these rivers. It's just, again, it's logistics and time and money to be able to get things into these rivers. Okay. So from that data, just a couple quick examples here of what we found so far. We've only done 1 year so far. But the Great Chazy River, this is Champlain, New York, right up near the Canadian border. We caught 845 lamprey in our trap up there. These are adults trying to spawn. And they came back, and that one in the picture is a big, big female who's ripe and probably could put a squeeze on her and she'd shoot eggs out at that point. That's a very ripe female. You can see her back fin there. I photoshopped it, but that's what it would look like when we put a little triangular notch in the fin. And that's all we do. We put a little notch in there, then we take them back down river, release them, and see when they come back. Based on that, again, using the equations that I won't go into today, we came out with an estimate of almost, well, over 2,200 sea lamprey adults going into that river. And these numbers have been kind of verified and validated by the Great Lakes over 50 years of doing this. And the way they do it and the mathematics and methodology are pretty sound. They've done the hard work to ground truth this. So we're pretty confident that these numbers are in the ballpark at least. Mullen Brook is a very small tributary. It's probably 10 feet across. This is down kind of near the Champlain Bridge on the New York side. It's a very cold river. It comes off the Adirondacks, and it's probably only oh gosh, quarter of a mile from the first fall line to the lake itself. But in there, we were able to get 62 lamprey, very small river. And from that, we could find out it's not quite the same amount of inflation, but that's because of the number that came back. It's all in the equation. So we had 129. 129 lamprey can do a lot of reproducing. Each female lamprey carries between 60 to 100,000 eggs. That's a lot of eggs for a fish that big. They're very tiny eggs. So you've seen salmon eggs. They're like the size of a pea. Lamprey eggs are the size of a poppy seed. So there's a lot of eggs in the sea lamprey. Another thing we're doing that's made a big difference in our program, and shout out to Ken, who I introduced earlier, has been designated as my person to work on this. We used to go out and do sea lamprey control on deltas and try to find where the lamprey were. Well, good luck finding a needle in a haystack on the delta. I mean, the Ausable Delta is several square miles of area. I don't have 75 staff members to go out there and search for lamprey on an area that big. So we would hunt and peck. We would do our best. We'd set up a unit, or why did that go on? We'd set up an area that was uniform, and we would just sample it, and we'd drop a survey, a big hose down to the bottom. If you've ever seen gold mine dredging, where they kind of vacuum up the bottom of the river to get gold, that's what we use, one of those things. But we have an electrified cone on the end that gets the lamprey irritated. They swim up a little bit, and then we turn on the pump and we suck them all up to the boat to find out if they're there. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, but there's no other way to find a lamprey that's living 20 feet down on the lake bottom. So in the past, I mentioned that we would do it just by kind of hunt and peck and try to do the best we could with GPS coordinates. Now we've taken it to the next level where we're using sonar data to map the bottom of the habitat. And these different colors represent different iterations of roughness and hardness. So it could be silt or sand or rock or gravel, and it shows up on the sonar. It tells us what the bottom of the lake looks like. And from that, when I do have my guys go out and drop the bell down and suck the lamprey up from the bottom, if it turns out that they're finding all of the lamprey, oh, that's not showing up. Is it this one? Oh, it isn't. There it is. Okay. If they all show up in the orange and they're not showing up in the green or the pink or whatever colors, we can say, oh, well, apparently orange is the preferred area where lamprey really like to live. So now, instead of wasting our time all summer long just blindly dropping hoses down in the water looking for lamprey, we can focus in on areas where lamprey are most likely to be. And even more importantly, after we verify that by doing the sampling, we can then program that fancy computer that I showed you, the Death Star computer. We can have that set up to only treat those areas. We use an extremely expensive chemical to treat the deltas. A 5-gallon pail of chemical costs $700, and we go through thousands. So it's an expensive endeavor to put chemical on the delta. So when we're putting that kind of cost and effort into this, we want to make sure we're getting it right and using it efficiently. So by doing this, we've been able to decrease cost again. We've been able to focus on where the lamprey are going to be. So we're not only more cost effective, we're more efficient in finding lamprey and putting the chemical on them as well. And I'm really happy and proud of our guys and team in that I think we've made a much bigger improvement in delta applications and efficiency than we've been able to have in the past. And it's no knock on the past, it's just that technology has developed over the years and provided us with this opportunity to be able to really increase and enhance the program. One more thing is I've spoken in the past about our barrier in Quebec. I wanted to put in a shout out for our work in Canada. It's only one barrier, but it's a big barrier, and it costs a lot of money to put this thing in. If this was New York or Vermont, we would be putting in chemical in here, no question. It's a perfect stream to do a chemical treatment. Unfortunately, Quebec doesn't allow us to use chemical in rivers. It's their provincial policy. So we've asked and asked and asked, and we get told no, 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 and I've stopped asking. So we put a barrier in instead, and it's a big barrier, as I said. It's a seasonal barrier. So all that metal you see in the picture up there in the river gets put in and taken out with a crane every spring during spawning season. So it's only in the river while the lamprey are spawning. after the lamprey are done, we yank it out of the river, put it on the bank, and it sits there until the next spring. So the townspeople love this. It's you can imagine rural Notre Dame to Stanbridge, Quebec doesn't have a whole lot going on. We're like the new biggest thing they've ever seen. So we're an ecotourism attraction for Notre Dame to Stanbridge. Just kind of showing you the difference that it's made over the year. COVID was 2020 and 2021. We couldn't go to Canada, which was really unfortunate. So we have no data on that. We didn't do anything there because we couldn't go. You see the larval population estimate for sea lamprey, that's gone down, and we're at 18,000 now. So this is number of the little ones that I showed you in the picture earlier. This isn't the big adults. These are the little ones that live in the bottom of the sediment. This river is 17 miles long, and there's lamprey for all 17 miles. And even in 2014, we had started decreasing things a little bit. But before that, we had population estimates over 100,000 in that river. So we've brought things down, and even after COVID, we're seeing differences, and we hope that we have even fewer sea lamprey in the future as we continue to use this. Because now those adults are not able to get past this barrier. Actually, I should have mentioned, if you look in that picture, just in the background of the screen, up towards the top, that's the Pike River. That's probably more well-known. That flows into the top of Muskellunge Bay. It's the biggest tributary in Quebec going into the Muskellunge Bay, or probably Lake Champlain even. And then Morpion Stream is a tributary to that. And the lamprey tend to go into Morpion because, again, not in the picture, there's a barrier of an actual dam, not a lamprey barrier, but a hydro dam. I should say that, not a hydro dam, old mill dam just upstream of there in the town. And the lamprey can't get past that. So the lamprey veer off and go into here instead. That's why there were so many lamprey. They could go up the Pike River as far as they could get. Then they got blocked by the dam, and they said, okay, can't go that way. We'll go this way instead. And they would go in Morpion. 17 miles of spring-fed, pristine habitat. It was one of the biggest or densest packed rivers in the basin. We had to control it. So using this innovative technology, again, a barrier, no one's ever built one like this. I won't go into all the details, but it's a pretty fancy barrier that we built here. We're now stopping those adults from going into that river, so they can't lay eggs, they can't make nests, they can't fertilize the eggs, and we're not getting lamprey reproduction in there anymore. And over time, as those year classes develop and get older and leave, we can't affect the ones that are already alive in there. They're going to leave. We can't hit them with chemical. So 4 or 5 years worth we can't get. However, the new ones aren't being replaced as the adults can no longer get in there. One more thing I wanted to highlight is many of you may have even seen this. So in Shelburne, we just built a lamprey barrier. The road or the bridge you see at the top of the picture on the left is, Falls Road in Shelburne. And you can see that this barrier is literally almost under it, right by the bridge embankment there. And we built this last fall and winter, got this thing in place, and it's right on bedrock. So it's sitting there. If you go downstream about 100 yards, 150 yards, there's the big pool. Those of you who have ever fished the Platte River know about the pool down from the bridge at the falls, and that's kind of a popular fishing spot. So this barrier doesn't affect any of the migrating species, such as steelhead go in this river, probably a lot of other species that migrate from the lake up to that pool. However, this cascade, right where this barrier is built, is so steep that there's no migration going past this point. Bernie has been in there with his survey team and done fish surveys over the years, and they've never found evidence of other species that migrate ever being upstream of this point. So by putting in this barrier, it's a great kind of a win-win situation. Lamprey can get up this far and go up farther because they have that suction cup on their mouth, and they just kind of inch their way up on the bedrock and do little spurts at a time, and they can make their way all the way up. Whereas a steelhead says 150 yards of whitewater, yeah, I'm good. I'll take a break from that. The lamprey can do it incrementally, one at a time, and make it all the way up there. So this barrier now prevents them from getting up there. They get as far as that barrier, they can't get any further up. They might want to try to go up and over the barrier, but they can't because the picture on the left shows you that the downstream edge has a lip on it. Well, a lamprey can go up and over a smooth structure or a structure that doesn't have a lip. But if there's a lip on it, it can't go backwards and get around. That just doesn't work. So that lip is just a simple engineering tweak that we put on the top of the barrier to prevent the lamprey from getting up and over that and continuing on their way. And I'm all happy with my picture here too. We built this in Shelburne, and the people in Shelburne have nice things and they like nice things, and they didn't want ugly concrete. So we got this cool looking stone form. I couldn't believe it. They dye the concrete and they press this form in there, and that stone looking thing is actually just fancy concrete. I tell people, oh yeah, this beautiful old stone barrier, and no, it's just concrete, but it looks really cool. So that's we have many more things going on too. I won't go into all of them today, but these are some representatives of the things that we're working on, and we'll be able to talk more about it, and I can tell you more things if you want. And just my last slide, and we can do questions. I always try to remind people that we don't kill sea lamprey because we don't like sea lamprey. Well, maybe that's true, but there's a much bigger reason, and that's because we want fish like this. And I know Kurt already had his picture up there. It's a great picture. So we want to show that we've got fish like this in the lake now. We didn't used to have salmon like this in the lake, and we couldn't have fish like this in the lake without lamprey control. It warms my heart to hear the salmonid folks say, hey, thanks for the good lamprey control. And I tell them, hey, thanks for making the great fish. So together, we're a good combination and able to produce a fishery.
So right after the break, I'll try to wake everybody up here with a fish that eats all the other fish we've been talking about so far today. And I only say that, half jokingly. There was some concern when we first started talking about muskie restoration about that very possibility. You're going to stock something that's going to eat all the other fish that we like. There's really no truth to that. I won't get into the details of the biology, but a lot of studies have shown that while muskie are opportunistic and will snap something up that happens to swim by its nose, they're very keyed in on certain prey types, mostly soft-rayed fish, things like suckers and fall fish and whitefish and cisco and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a little bit of background about muskie or muskellunge. I call them muskie for short. A lot of people may not realize that muskie are actually native to the Lake Champlain watershed. And as a state, Vermont's the only New England state where they are native in that sense. Historically, they were found in the late 1800s and early 1900s, fairly widespread, but at low numbers, like most muskie populations tend to be. They're not a high-density fish species. They're uncommon even in the best of waters where they occur. So they're infrequently encountered, but they were spread fairly widely across the lake. But that was primarily restricted to the northern end of the lake. So there's two main rivers where muskie populations, native muskie populations, were described in some of the early biological surveys in the 1900s. One was the Great Chazy River up here on the left in pink, and the other one was the Missisquoi River. Now, both of those rivers have dams on them, and those are the yellow dots on those rivers. But interestingly, those dams, their muskie populations, were also found above those dams. So the one that I'm most familiar with, and I'll talk about today, is the Missisquoi River. And if anybody knows where the Swanton Dam is in Swanton on the Missisquoi River, there was a population upstream of that as well. And that dam has been in place in some form since 1780, 90, something like that. A long time. And so those muskie, were locked above that river as part of its natural fish population when the dam was built and stayed there ever since. For reasons that we don't really know, the numbers of muskie in the northern part of the lake, particularly those two rivers, started decreasing slowly over time. By the 1970s, the Vermont population was actually 100% restricted to that portion of Missisquoi River between the Swanton Dam and the Highgate Springs Dam upstream. Really bad turn of events in 1978 or 1979. There's a pulp and paper mill plant upstream that had a spill of untreated paper mill waste that went into the river. And as far as we can tell, it eradicated the entire population of the Muskellunge River muskie. Subsequent surveys were done to try to see if any were left, and none were ever found. And at that point in time, the assumption was muskie were extirpated from the Vermont waters of Lake Champlain or its tributaries. So there is kind of a longer history on the New York side of stocking muskie that goes back to the 60s. Nicole Balk from New York, DC is here, could answer more questions specific about that. But they started stocking muskie into the Great Chazy in the 1960s and continue to do so today. Right through up until 2008, they were stocking fry, very small muskie, about 100,000 a year above the waterworks dam. In 2009, they moved to stocking fall fingerlings. So these fish are 10 plus inches in size. And because of that, they reduced the numbers and they stock just over 1,000 a year on average now. All of those fish come from Western New York, from Chautauqua Lake. They have a hatchery on Chautauqua Lake that collects wild muskie from the lake, spawns them. The progeny are then redistributed across New York. We had a muskie stocking program in the 1980s. I'm not really sure of the reason why it came about the way it did, but our department decided that they were going to stock muskie from 1980 to 1986 in Otter Creek. They got muskie at that time from Pientka Reservoir in Pennsylvania. I think we traded salmon for muskie with them at the time. And we started stocking, we stocked about 400,000 muskie above the Virgins Dam, if anybody's familiar with Otter Creek. So again, above the landlocked or the lake connected portion of Otter Creek. And they did it for 5 years, and they just, said, oh, it didn't work because they never heard anybody catching fish. They never saw any in their surveys, and they abandoned it after 5 years. I came along in the department in 1997. I started getting interested in muskie, and I started looking at some of this history and background. And we were interested mostly about the Muskellunge, but we wanted to know more about where else muskie might be in the lake. And so I started putting some outreach materials out, trying to get people to contact me. And all of a sudden I started getting these emails from people saying, I catch muskie in Otter Creek all the time. I don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't successful. Look at these fish. And, so we started looking closer, and there were some people that had, kind of a good thing going there. There was a handful of people that were catching 30-pound muskie in Otter Creek, and nobody else knew about it. And that was above the dam in Virgins. Since then, we've expanded our surveys and started finding them downstream as well. So if you've ever seen the Virgins Dam, it's a pretty big mark on the landscape, but still, they came down over that dam, and they've been now have an established population in the lower river as well. And these are all Otter Creek muskie caught in the last few years. These anglers like to send me pictures when they catch one. That's the Virgins Dam right behind the guy in the top right. And we also are seeing, these smaller fish like down on the bottom right, but also these sized fish as well. These are 12-inch muskie that I collected during a survey above Virgins this past summer in 2022. So there's evidence and sign that we're still seeing self-sustaining, reproduction in Otter Creek from 5 years of stocking fry in the early 1980s. So that's a good sign. So looking back at Muskellunge River, the last known location of Vermont's native population, we started, being able to take some cues. Okay, Otter Creek, we know that they've been successful there. How did that happen? What can we do to do something similar in Muskellunge and maybe try to get that population back again? So we started, investigating the river itself, looking at its habitat, looking at its forage fish, what's out there for food, what the river flows are like. And the other thing we really wanted to know is, are they really truly gone from the Muskellunge River? Because we thought that they never took in the first place in Otter, but then we found them. Maybe the same thing was going on. And back in the 80s, the sampling after the chemical spill, just wasn't the right type of sampling to find any leftover muskie. So we did quite a lot of surveys. We put the word out again, looking for anglers that might have some. The only muskie we could get appeared to be coming from the Shazy River. And as a matter of fact, we were able to get genetic samples from the fish that they were stocking, as well as some of the fish that were being caught on the Vermont side, but below the Swanton Dam, including this one here. This is Chris Beebe, lives in Swanton. That's the current state record muskie. It was 38 pounds, 52.5 inches long, caught in 2005. When we tested it for its genetics, it was one of the fish from the Shazy River that had been stocked at some point there, because it was a match to the Chautauqua strain fish from Western New York. So we didn't really know what kind of genetics we might have had in the Missisquoi originally. Because it's connected to the St. Lawrence River, geographically, it's probably the St. Lawrence River strain, what Vermont had. But we didn't have any evidence that they were still there. We had lots of evidence that the Chautauqua strain muskie are in the system and growing and surviving and getting quite large from the New York efforts on their side of the lake. So we decided at that point that we could start stocking muskie using the same strain and not add anything different or unique to the lake. So we wouldn't be adding any new genetic material to Lake Champlain. So we started stocking Chautauqua strain fish in 2008, and I have a slide coming up on that. And it was a cooperative, again, part of this Fish and Wildlife Management Cooperative that we're fortunate to have on Lake Champlain. We get those fish from New York for Missisquoi River stocking as part of an agreement. They're free. We don't pay for them. We go out. We send a hatchery truck all the way to Western New York. We pick them up in August, and we bring them back. That's contingent on them having available fish. We're sort of, low on the totem pole. They fulfill their own stocking needs across the state out of that hatchery first. Whatever's left over, I have access to. So it's been really great, partnership to have. So like I said, in 2008 was the first year we made this decision to really get going with the stocking. Happened to be a year of low surplus availability. So they gave us a token amount, I like to call it. 250 fish were probably eaten an hour later by bass and bowfin. But over time, we've had some pretty good stocking efforts to the point where as of this past year, we've stocked now 60,000 musky fingerlings into the Missisquoi River in areas of lower Missisquoi River. We started stocking the lower Missisquoi River first. 5 years later, we brought the upper Missisquoi above Swanton Dam online. There were still some reservations about us knowing that that's where they last existed. So we did a little bit of extra work up there for a couple more years to 100% determine that there is no native muskie left up there. We made that decision, around 2012, 2013, and started stocking them up there. So now we split what we get from New York, and it's variable. It depends on what is surplus, but it is prone to having these gaps, like 2018 to 2021. They just had a run of bad luck. They had some disease outbreaks. They had low egg collection one year. So we went 4 years without actually getting any fish at all. Fortunately, we had a bunch of good years prior to that where we were able to stock fish and get them in the system. So during that time, we were doing a lot of surveys. So here's some of the areas that we put fish. Map on the right is zoomed in on the upper Missisquoi above Swanton Dam. There's about 10 or 11 miles of river up there. Is that right? Really great habitat, full of fall fish, golden shiners, white suckers, red horse suckers, all the things muskie like to eat. And then, of course, you have the lower river where we put them in the below Swanton Dam, but also in areas throughout the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge. Really great, complex beds of vegetation in there. So, we have a lot of habitat. We have great food. And so we're, been excited to watch this develop. So one thing we do every year after we stock these 6-inch fish or so in the middle of August is we go back late October, early November into these rivers and we do some electrofishing and we see if we can catch them again. And we've been pretty successful at that. These are all little fish that we're getting in the fall surveys that are showing us that between The third week of August, when we stocked them in early November, they're nearly doubling their size. So the average is 5.5 inches typically when they come from the hatchery, and we're catching them 8.5, 9, almost 10 inches in length. And sometimes they're even a little bigger than that. So survival has been really good. Growth looks really good. And, so the next step is to, see if they're continuing on and becoming adults. And there's two reasons I should have mentioned earlier. I think it was on the slide, but I glossed over it. We have two objectives here, really, with restoring this native population. One is to restore a native population. It's a fish that we had. We should have it back again. It's an integral part of our native fish community. And so we really want to see them become established, and we really don't expect this to be a forever stocking program either. We're hoping at some point they get to the point like on Otter Creek where they start self-sustaining. They reproduce naturally. And the second part is that we want to provide this as a fishing opportunity to anglers. There's a lot of anglers out there I've talked to who've caught their first muskie ever since we're starting to do this, and they're very excited. It's a pretty impressive fish. They fight hard. They get very large. And so it's a really great addition to our fishing opportunities in and around Lake Champlain. So over time, we're doing electrofishing, again, specifically for muskie, but we also have started seeing them show up as bycatch in all of our other surveys. So you got Bernie up there in the top, and with a big muskie, Dave, who works with them on the Missisquoi River. Those are done probably during walleye surveys, right? Salmon. So in the fall, they're out collecting salmon. In the spring, they're collecting walleye for other programs that we do. And they're getting muskie mixed in these rivers at the same time. Some of them are getting quite large, upwards of, 45 inches, 43 to 45 inches and 20 pounds. So our growth rates are good. We're seeing them mixed year classes. So these are all recent pictures from the last couple of years. So we're seeing that we have young 2- and 3-year-old muskie coming into the adult population, as well as older, mature fish. So we're also starting to see what we're seeing in Otter Creek, this is a really exciting part. We go out and we do, these fall surveys like I talked about, and we're looking for the little ones that have grown a little bit, but we're starting to pick up fish that are a little bit bigger than that. So 14, 15 inches, 17, 18 inches. Those are fish from the previous year stocking, the previous year stocking before that. One unanticipated benefit that we had of that 4-year gap from 2018 to 2021, where we didn't do any stocking, we continued doing the fall surveys, not having stocked any fish that previous August. And we start seeing this. Not a lot of numbers, but you could hear me, in Virgins yelling from Missisquoi when we netted the first one of these, and Bernie has caught them now as well in some of his other sampling efforts. We're seeing natural reproduction starting to pop off in Missisquoi River in both locations, both below the dam and above the dam. So we have mature year classes, males and females that are mixing, finding each other, reproducing, and they're surviving. So this is, really exciting news for us to see this evidence of natural reproduction. Like I said, that we didn't really plan it that way, but those 4 years gave us 4 years of no stocking where we could 100% know for sure that if we catch a fish this size, it didn't come from a hatchery, it came from natural reproduction. So, this is something we're going to keep monitoring going forward. It's worth mentioning that in Vermont, muskie fishing regulations are different than they are on the New York side of the lake right now, and this was something we implemented shortly after we started our stocking program to give the fish a chance, essentially, to grow and reach this age of maturity without being, prone to harvest, so that, we can get that natural reproduction going. So right now, you cannot keep a muskie in Vermont. It's catch and release only. We don't stop you from targeting them, and you can go out and catch them, but you can't keep one. That may change eventually in the future, but in general, muskie fishing across its range, upper Midwest, Canada, there's low harvest rates anyways on muskie. They're more looked at as a trophy fish species, not really, good to eat. But, you know, we just wanted that extra level of precaution there at first. But this is something we'll revisit eventually. And like I said, you know, we're generating a lot of angler excitement. We're seeing, I get contacted a lot by anglers who are catching really nice fish in both parts of the lake. So this, the one on the right is above the dam in Swanton. The one on the left, you can actually see the dam in the background. You know, these two big fish are below Missisquoi River. You know, we're getting kids excited about it. So it's, you know, it's really becoming something that is going to be good for the long run. So we're even seeing them being caught through the ice now, which is pretty unusual for muskie, but it's happening up around North Hero. So what's next? We really, you know, have this long-term goal of establishing this population as a natural, naturally reproducing population. So, and making sure that we get to that point where it's actually a targetable, viable fishery, where you have a real chance of going out in the right spots with the right gear and catching a muskie. So we're going to continue monitoring this population. We're trying to learn a little bit more about where this natural reproduction is happening. We really have no clue. They're just kind of randomly showing up, you know, mixed in. So, you know, talking to other muskie researchers, we need to identify the habitats, you know, that they're utilizing. We don't know where they're congregating in May. It's the time of year they spawn. And once we know that, where this muskie population is spawning, we can start doing more focused and targeted sampling efforts in the midsummer, looking for progeny of those wild fish before we do stocking in late August. And at some point, we may, you know, move our stocking strategy to go to an every other year stocking. And at some point, we can just stop it altogether, we hope. So we need to identify those sites and, you know, establish methods where we can effectively catch these fish and really start quantifying the success of that natural reproduction that we're starting to see, you know, just starting up right now.
Working a lot on sturgeon right now and a bunch of other things as well. So we're going to kind of shift gears here. It's been, you know, salmonids in the morning, and now we're off to perch and walleye. Okay, we'll go that. So we're going to start off with perch and then lead into walleye. So why would we do a perch survey? Well, over the years, Vermont has done these mailing surveys, statewide angler surveys, and we do them typically every 10 years. All those years, perch are always listed as the most preferred species for resident anglers during ice fishing. Ice fishing for perch is just what is done in this area. It's really popular. So that's one of the reasons why, the popularity of that. If we go back and kind of adding, I mean, this is a little bit older data than Nicole's current data. We did some winter creel surveys on both the northern area of Champlain and the southern area of Champlain in 2015 and 2016, looking at, these were full on-the-water creel surveys, interviewing anglers. If we take the expanded numbers out, now there's a whole bunch of math that goes on with this, expanding effort estimates, catch rates, and all that. We're estimating that almost 750,000 yellow perch are caught annually. And of that, about 500,000 are harvested. Well, that's just the winter. So we're talking about 3 months, good ice. We tie that into some of the open water surveys that were done in 2015 and 16 over that same period. Again, not covering all the areas of the lake, but only portions of that. You know, you can add another 200,000 caught and another 100,000 harvested. So based upon those creel surveys and some of those expansion numbers, you know, you're close to 1 million perch caught annually on Champlain, with over 600,000 harvested. And again, those are kind of low numbers because we're missing some of the areas. And the other thing, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I took slides from our Master Angler program. You go through our Master Angler program for yellow perch, that's what we see. Kids holding the fish up. I mean, anglers are getting their first experience on yellow perch. They can go out, they can catch them. It's really important in that sense. So this is kind of one of the reasons why going through that. In addition to the why, you know, I talk about it being a perch survey. We're looking at both yellow perch and white perch. Yellow perch are native to the lake. White perch appeared in the late 80s, kind of worked their way up. I think we found them in Missisquoi Bay sometime in the early 2000s, and that was their first occurrence. So they made it lake-wide in that period of time. So how yellow perch and white perch interact is an important point. So kind of understanding how these invasive species impact things. So what are we doing? Well, mostly what we're focusing on is a summer gillnet survey at various locations. And again, it's a primary focus on yellow perch, white perch. They just get caught in gillnets well. Things like bass and sunfish just don't fit well into the gill nets to get hung. In 2022, we pushed it a little bit harder and we did a lake-wide coverage. So we pretty much went all the way down to Benson and we're all the way up to Missisquoi Bay. We've been doing this perch survey for a number of years now. Typically, we focus on maybe Otter Creek North as our survey area, but last year we added some more stations. Similar to what I talked about earlier, we're doing information on catch. We have biological information on length and growth. And we're able to look at it annually kind of across stations in different areas, but also across years, see where we're going. Here's all of it. Last year tells the whole story, right? A lot of information on there. So the locations on the graph are basically north to south. We start at Missisquoi Bay. We go all the way down to Benson. We have our little dots matching where we are, and the catch per unit effort is fish per 24-hour net set. And if we look at this and talk about those invasive species and how these species are interacting, we can see up north for a few of the areas like Missisquoi Bay and St. Albans Bay, we're kind of about a 50-50 split in terms of the catch, half yellow perch, half white perch. For most of the other areas of the northern part of the lake, yellow perch are the primary species. As we move south, we hit things like Winooski Delta, Shelburne Bay. We can see kind of numbers go down in perch. Well, these are the deep water areas, deep water in there. We're talking about perch more warm water, shallower depths. As we continue farther south, Porter Bay, Potash Bay, we start getting more of that. And then we start seeing the occurrence of white perch becoming more of the catch. And as we move even farther south, white perch become more of a dominant catch of those perch. So that was kind of like 1 year snapshot across all those stations. But we're also interested in what's happening at stations over years. And here's kind of Missisquoi Bay. Now understand, we have like 14 stations up north that are done annually. They've been done since around 2009, 2010 starting. So we have that data. I could do the whole day talk on perch if we wanted to, but we're just going to pull a couple sites and go over them. So we see our yellow perch catch rate, yellow perch on the left, white perch on the right for Missisquoi Bay. We have a few years, 2010, 2019 was really strong catches of yellow perch. But overall, we're not really seeing any trends, major declines or expansions of them. White perch, well, we saw a little bit stronger catch in those early years, and that might have been related to them kind of appearing in Missisquoi Bay and then kind of dropping down a little bit, maybe forming a new level. So we have these kind of like trends over time and looking at multiple stations. And we have our nose sampling in 2020. That was our COVID. We got out and got a few stations done, but things were a little challenging. Length information. So if we take the average length of these perch on these stations, again, we're staying in Missisquoi Bay. We can definitely see that, yellow perch in those early few years, we actually kind of started to see a little trending decline in the average size of yellow perch over those years up to about 2017. It kind of popped back up and did some other stuff going on there. Not sure exactly why, but definitely these are what that trend data is looking at. And then we see the white perch. Again, they're both on the same scales for sizes. White perch definitely bigger. We see them kind of going there. And then in those later years, a little bit of a drop in the size. Growth. What are these fish? How are they breaking down in age? Well, always surprises me, and I surprise a lot of people when I start talking about yellow perch and white perch ages. So we're looking at, for the most part, the otolith, the bone of the inner ear. We basically process it, and we're able to age it. Similar to tree rings, we're able to basically get annual marks on there. That's a photo of a white perch caught in Missisquoi Bay last year. 11.4 inches came out to be 18 years old. So we see a lot of this information, and if we go back years into the 70s and 80s when we were looking at scales just underestimated ages. And as we look at these other structures, we see it. And looking at the age distribution of either of those graphs, you can see, there's fish 10, 12, 13 years old are fairly common. And we're seeing fish grow out. The yellow perch, 7 inches, a pretty popular size. It's like 4 years, 5 years to get to 7 inches. And then white perch kind of coming in, a little slower growth in the beginning, but they kind of peak out a little higher later on. But a lot of that information is just showing us that we're seeing that, looking at this information across these stations, across the areas. Yes, the different basins of the lake grow differently. Missisquoi Bay is very different than Shelburne Bay. That's the part of Champlain that we have to appreciate. It's a diverse system. So for our perch kind of summary, generally our catch per unit efforts for the period we've been looking at has been relatively stable. There's no major trends or drops or anything that's going on there. We see some annual variability, some years better than others. The length frequency, the relative length has generally been steady. Again, nothing kind of giving us that, wow, there's a big problem coming forward. We're just looking at that. And then there's more to come on the length to age information. This gets even more complex as we have areas and regions of the lake. I'm kind of diving into more of that data and more of that information to come forward. And I think I shift to walleye, so I'm going to take a moment here to kind of just any questions on perch before I. No question on the perch. Everyone's happy with perch. If I had a fish fry going out there in the area, would you be happy? Yeah. Okay. All right. So for our walleye component, I'm going to kind of cover 3 areas. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on that. I'm going to talk about some of our current stocking for Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and then also talk about some of our assessments. This was one of our record walleye. I think it was it beat again? That's the current record. Okay. Caught basically ice fishing, getting that thing through a hole. I just can't imagine. Yeah. Up near, that's up near, it's off of Tabor Point, off that way. So just a little south of Missisquoi Bay. It's been standing, for 4 years now? 5? So Lake Champlain, walleye. Well, walleye is a popular sport fish. And they're popular for a number of reasons. People like to catch them and people like to eat them. The walleye fillets, really tender, flaky, nice white meat, not a strong fishy taste. It's very popular. They are native to Lake Champlain. In the 50s and through the 70s, we had really strong populations, and some stuff started to go on there at that point. We started to have a perceived decline of the walleye probably in the 80s through the 90s, and then at that point, we started to do some management actions. We tightened up the bag limits. We put length limits on them. We closed some of the spawning river sections, the spawning areas, to try to protect those populations and let them naturally reoccur. And we also started some stocking programs to try to enhance and push those, the walleye to kind of recover on their own. At that same time, in those early years, there were some genetic studies. And it's kind of showing that these rivers are distinct populations. The Missisquoi River population is the Missisquoi River population. They go out into the inland sea, they go out by Isle Lamont, but they're genetically different than the Winooski population and the Lamoille population. And as such, we've been taking management actions to actually manage them as those individual stocks. So when we do our stocking and we take fish from Missisquoi, we go back to Missisquoi River. So we're kind of trying to consider those factors. So walleye stocking. Well, walleye are not trout or salmon. They don't like hatcheries. They are small. When you saw the photo Kurt put of the eggs, salmon eggs coming out, walleye eggs are just little pinheads. This on the photo on the top there is a recently hatched walleye fry, and that's a penny. So you're talking about a fish that's just so tiny, so delicate. You move it around much, you net it much, it dies. And those fish basically have a wide size range of food you need to feed them. They have to evolve. That food size has to evolve as they grow. And then at a certain point when they grow, they start eating each other. So you end up having a tank with a few thousand fish in it or a pond, and now you have a couple hundred and they're twice the size of everybody else. So it makes a difficult thing. So it's been a long process. Traditional walleye culture has been grow them out, hatch them in the hatchery, put them into a pond. And you do basically zooplankton in the pond, you enrich the system, and you try to maintain them that way. It's not perfect. It has a lot of challenges. You're dealing with these small systems. Things happen. We've been working, Vermont Fish and Wildlife has been looking at these intensive culture systems. So basically saying, how do we do that same type of stuff in the hatchery itself, in a contained environment, a controlled environment? And basically, we're starting to get this stuff all figured out. We've been now able to produce larger and more fingerlings than some of the traditional pond production that we got. Kevin Kelsey, who's the hatchery manager at Edweed, has actually been working on this system for many years, to the point where, this is like cutting edge walleye culture. He has a chapter in the new walleye book, basically on how to culture these fish. So we're using this cutting edge technology to grow these fish. We're getting them to size earlier than a pond by weeks, and getting them out of that system. And then we also mark everything. All these fish that get stocked, we've been putting into a bath. They absorb this. It's an oxytetracycline. They absorb it into their bones, the otolith of their inner ear, and we're able to go back and do an assessment to say, okay, how many fish are we seeing of this size that are from our stocking? So we're able to assess that stocking evaluation and whether it's successful. Our current stocking rotation has basically been 3 primary rivers, Missisquoi, Winooski, and Poultney. We've been doing them on a 3-year rotation where we do a river and just rotate through. We have Otter Creek, which from our historical tagging data from the 70s and 80s, didn't really identify it as a spawning river, identified it, I would call it kind of a foraging river. Fish that spawn in southern Champlain work their way up. After post-spawning, they're looking for food. They moved into Otter Creek, they started to feed. So we're not managing Otter Creek as a spawning river, but more of an area. So we take portions of these fish for certain rivers. There's a Lake Champlain Walleye Association pond down in Virgins that cultures some of these fish. So Otter Creek gets these small infusions on a regular basis from that pond. So we can see kind of the table down below as we look through. You can see how they rotate through. And then those years when we're doing main lake fish, Winooski or Poultney River, there's a small number of fish that go into Otter Creek. Okay, I'm really not even there yet. Stocking contributions. Well, we looked at this otolith. We looked at these ages. We see that this is a photo. Shawn does most of our stocking evaluation. You look at the otolith under a certain wavelength light, there's lines illuminate saying it's from stocking. These are our stocking contributions. We look at 3-year-old males every 3 years. So in those early years, 2000 to about 2008, we were seeing somewhere between 20 to maybe 40, 50, 70% of those 3-year-olds we looked at were from our stocking. Something changed. Look at Winooski River. We see that starting in 2009. We were seeing like 100% of those 3-year-olds were from our stocking. So some of that's going on. So again, we're monitoring all these things as we go forward. Kind of going to speed on some of our assessments because I got a time constraint here. Last year, we did our walleye assessment at Sandy Point. Sandy Point was a historical site. It was a walleye hatchery in the 50s on Lake Champlain. And that's typically done on a 5-year rotation. And then we did our assessment on Missisquoi River last year as part of our spawning run. So Sandy Point started in the early 50s. Top photo there on the right is actually the old winch done. Photo from the early 50s where they're using a leather belt to drive the winch with a hit or miss engine. Every photo I have, I don't think this one has it, but there's usually a pipe or a cigarette out of their mouth as they're going. We've now gone to a hydraulic winch. So basically there's a 600-foot long net brought out by boats 1,000 feet from shore and pulled back in. Takes about 20 minutes to do one haul. And then we're on a 5-year rotation for this. Basically it forms a big C as it comes into the shore and catches fish. Well, our 2022 survey didn't do as well as we'd hope. This is fishery science at the best. We got about 29 seine hauls, which is pretty typical of our season. We're out there about 6 weeks, spread out. We did only catch 15 walleye. On the side there is the graph that shows our walleye catch. And if you look at those early 50s and 60s, you know, you had catches of 30 per seine haul. You had them over 20 per seine haul. Well, that kind of went away. This year, we're down more, you know, under 1 per seine haul. We did catch 29 different fish species, which is pretty typical for us, and we handled over 6,000 fish in that sampling window. We handle a lot of different species. You know, these are perch, white perch, yellow perch. We even got a few muskies in the seine. Across there is a lot of different graphs of different species. I'm not really interested in getting to the details of each one, but the most part, catches for a lot of the species were down. So it wasn't just walleye, it was yellow perch were down. We had white perch down, we had bullhead down. It just, a lot of the catches were down, and kind of what was going on. Well, wrapping up the seining component, we were getting vegetation. We've never seen this before. I've done seining now at least 4 seining years, helped with a couple other ones. We were hauling in, those black tubs are full of this partially dead, floating, partially submerged vegetation. That's like 1 seine haul that would come in with that. And it never seemed to end. You would think you're doing the same area day in and day out. You're sweeping this net through the same basic area, and it just kept coming. So I think a lot of that in this case was affecting our efficiency of the net. And again, all the catch was down for a lot of species. So our walleye assessment in the rivers, typically our spawning rivers are usually April is our busy time. We handled about 500 walleye from Muskellunge. We sent a group to the hatchery and we examined some for our stocking evaluation. Our length distribution, we had a nice wide length distribution, some of that. We have a difference between males and females. Females tend to be bigger, males smaller. We saw fish up to about 32 inches was our big size, but we see a lot of these different peaks in through there with I'll go to the age one here. And if we look at ages, for walleye, we're using dorsal spines. And you see an example, to see the light bands on there as those marks for each year. And we see that certain years, we have certain year classes that are stronger. So the 6-year-olds were making up over 50% of the females we were seeing. They were making over 40% of the males we were seeing in that year. And if we bring in our stocking component, well, 2016 was a stocking year. 2019 was a stocking year, which we see on our peak of our 3-year-olds. So we're seeing that stocking is really resulting in some returns. And we take that age information and we apply that to length information. And we see that basically by about 4 years old, these fish are at that 18-inch size limit. And we kind of see them plateau off, but they grow fairly fast. Usually the 3-year-olds we're seeing are just under the legal 18-inch size limit. But again, all the way out to like 17, 18 years old. So what did we learn? Well, Sandy Point, we have some weeds issue there. Not sure what we're going to do with that, but it's one of those challenges. Muskellunge River, our length distribution seems to be pretty good. We have a wide age structure range. We have strong year classes matching our stocking events. We have growth. I didn't get into the multi-years, but we have similar growth data over the years. Our stocking contribution is high. Yeah, our stocking's working, but I'd love to see more wild production. And what's our plan for this coming year? Well, we're actually going to be doing 2 rivers. We're doing Poultney and we're adding Lamoille. We've been assessing Lamoille River for a few years now and not seeing the angler effort and not seeing the fish in the river that we'd like to. So we're going to actually add that to the rotation. It'll be the first year Ed Weed is going to do 2 runs, two strains simultaneously, keep them separate. Fortunately, Poultney occurs early. Lamoille will be a little later. Lamoille is going to be on a different rotation, and we're still evaluating that full detail, probably a 4 to 6 year rotation for stocking based upon some hatchery capacity.
All right, so I'm going to try to talk fast. As you can tell, any one of us can talk for a half a day about any one of these projects at any given time. We do a lot of stuff, so it's hard not to, want to give you all the details. So I'll try to talk about bass quickly here. All right, so just a little bit of background on why we're doing bass surveys on Lake Champlain. So it's a fairly recent thing, unlike some of these other things we've been doing for decades and decades. We haven't really spent a lot of time looking at bass populations. We just kind of left them alone. They were doing great. People were catching fish. Everybody was happy. We had other priorities like trout and salmon. And it was also thought at first that, being such a big lake and having such diverse habitat and having two species of bass that occupy different types of habitat in the lake, it would be hard to get data that was really representative because it could be quite variable from area to area or even year to year. So it was really never done. But that started to change when pro bass tournaments found us. We were lucky for a lot of years that we had basically something special right here in our backyard that nobody else knew about. And bass anglers were really taking advantage of it locally. But in 1997, the first ever professional bass tournament was held on Champlain. Bassmasters came, they had a tournament. Host station was Mallett's Bay on the Vermont side. And that really put Lake Champlain on the map. It was televised, it was in their magazines, and everybody else started taking notice. And from that point on, we've been seeing a surge of professional bass angling pressure on Lake Champlain. So now there's two pro circuits that come here almost every year, Bassmasters as well as FLW, the Forest L. Wood circuit. And year after year after year, they started coming. They started breaking their own records in terms of number of bass caught, poundage caught. And you'd think that's unusual when they also have their tournaments in Texas and Florida and Arkansas. But our bass quality for sheer numbers of quality fish was like what is not being produced really anywhere else. So we consistently get ranked as one of the top 5 bass lakes in the country, which is saying a lot considering where we are, latitude wise and what our growing seasons look like. Spawning from that, bass fishing started getting more popular. It was already popular within resident anglers, but largemouth and smallmouth bass are now some of the top species targeted in all of Vermont when we do our statewide angler opinion surveys. And we've seen that incrementally increase over time as well. We do these angler surveys every 10 years where we send out a series of questions. It's pretty lengthy. We send it to 5,000 or 6,000 randomly selected resident, non-resident anglers over who have bought a license in the previous year. And we do it about every 10 years. So in the last 30 years, we've done 4 of these, with the most recent one being 2019. And, we see that bass, continues to be, one of the combined black bass, smallmouth and largemouth bass, one of the most popular species out there. And if you actually look, at some of these other species like, trout and salmon and perch, they're actually a little bit lower down on the list than bass are, combined across the state, not just Lake Champlain, but that's all inland waters in Vermont as well. So, it's there's a lot of effort out there, and it makes us want to think, that we want to maintain what we have. We want to be on the, making sure that it's slipping, we're not losing anything. So, along with the pro tournaments, there was a lot of local clubs that have been, doing tournaments, small regional things. Our tournament pressure went up, but the people who really spent a lot of time fishing for bass, after a few years of pro tournaments, started to voice concerns to us about, what was happening on the lake. And there's a couple of things that can come along with tournament fishing. One is post-release mortality. These fish are held in small live wells for a whole day, banged around in rough water sometime. Then they go through the weigh-in procedure. Some of those fish die after they get released. Even though it looks like it might swim away, there's some level of post-release mortality that can be, 5 to 10% of what gets released. And then there's also the tournament dispersal. On a lake like Lake Champlain, it's 120 miles long. These guys with bass boats, they can travel the length of that lake in an hour, and they do. And so they catch bass at the southern end of the lake, but then they weigh them in Plattsburgh or Burlington. And, what's that doing locally to the population? So our question is, is this amount of effort and the reshuffling of bass in the lake affecting, the quality of recreational bass fishing for everybody? Or is Lake Champlain just that productive that you reshuffle the deck and everything's still good? So what we wanted to do was, start looking at data that was available and start collecting our own data to try to understand whether that's the case. The first thing that I started doing is looking at the data that we were getting directly from the tournaments themselves. So these are the two pro bass tournaments. These are pro anglers that are very good at what they do. They're fishing for $100,000, on a single weekend. They have the ability and the skills to maximize, as I say, the potential of any lake. If there's fish out there that are 4, 5, 6 pounds, these pro bass anglers will catch them. So looking at their own data over a lot of years, if they're impacting the population themselves, you would expect to see, maybe a slight decline in what they're catching, in future years because those fish are either dying or not in the same spots. We've actually seen, a little bit of an increase over time. What this graph shows is basically, I looked at the top 10 finishers in any given tournament in a summer and average their daily catch, basically, over a 3-day tournament. So 5 fish, weighed this much on average for the people who finished in the top 10 out of 100 anglers. So you can see it's like 17, 18, 19 pounds, and it's held pretty consistent. So that's good. But again, these anglers are very good. They're going to work it for all it's worth. And, we need other data as well to corroborate, what we're seeing here. But that's a good sign. So in 2010, after thinking about it a long time, we decided, okay, let's start doing some standardized index surveys on bass populations. And it was the South Lake, where I manage out of the Rutland office, that we started doing it on. And there was a real reason for that, and that's because, like I said, these tournaments that are being held in Plattsburgh, in the early years, sort of the Ticonderoga area, or the South Lake, that is loosely called the Ticonderoga area, is anything south of the Champlain Bridge and Crown Point, is where the pro anglers would go if they wanted largemouth as part of their catch. They were fishing for smallmouth, they'd stay in the north part of the lake. Largemouth, it was heading south. They'd run the 80 miles, down to, Larrabee's and Benson and Ticonderoga, where there is really productive, vast beds of vegetation and big bass, big largemouth. But then those fish by the hundreds every weekend were being taken up to Plattsburgh and released there. And so this was a good place to really keep an eye on what was happening. So I established 20 stations that I do from about Dresden to the Champlain Bridge. And we go out at night and we electrofish those stations. Around 2018, Bernie started setting up similar stations on the north end around the inland sea in the islands and one in Shelburne Bay to start looking at the same sort of thing that I'm looking at on the South Lake. What we do is we shock at night along the shoreline in fairly shallow water when bass are near shore, mixed in vegetation, and susceptible to electrofishing. So this is kind of what, some of these stations look like. They're measured point to point. We do the same spot year after year after year to get a trend over time of what, the bass that are occupying the habitat in these specified locations look like. So Lake Champlain, some of the people that expressed concern about whether we really could do this or not were a little, right. Lake Champlain is very variable. Weather affects us a lot when we're trying to do this. If you get a few days of sustained rain or high winds, especially on the south end of the lake, the water gets turbid and it gets difficult to, to see the fish when you're shocking them and net them. But, year after year after year, as we start building this data set and being able to look at trends over time, we'll be able to see if there's any changes. Right now, what we're seeing in my most recent surveys, and this is specific to largemouth bass on Lake Champlain and smallmouth bass on southern Lake Champlain, we're still have, after 1997 to 2022, it's 25 years, we have really good length distribution still. So the concerns about anglers that they're taking all the big bass out of the population on the South Lake and letting them go in the North Lake doesn't seem to be, coming true. They may be removing those bass, but when we see a distribution like this, where we still get good numbers of fish up through that 18, 19, 20-inch length, and even larger than that in the largemouth bass category, 21, 22-inch fish, there's enough productivity in the Southern Lake that those 3 and 4 pounders are becoming the 5 and 6 pounders, year after year. The growth rates are good. There's still good habitat. There's still good fish, food, and those fish are growing. If we were to see, them cropping off by redistributing the biggest fish in the population to the north, we would see this distribution, decline precipitously, at the 18 or 19-inch mark or earlier, where they just wouldn't be there anymore, or there in much lower numbers. But a percent of catch when we go out and we do, 5 nights of electrofishing on southern Champlain, distribution still looks great. Another way that we can look at this is what our catch rates look like over time, and what this graph on the left is just another way to look at the distribution of the size of fish within the population, but over time. So what I showed you before was just a snapshot of 1 year. This is the same data, but just, shown in a different way since 2010. You can actually see that the size distribution, the proportional size distribution of those big fish has actually been, on a little bit of an increase even on the south end of the lake. And our catch rates are pretty good. This goes back to what I said about, variable weather conditions and environmental factors that, can make it difficult for us to catch all the fish that we know are there when we're shocking them if the water's really murky. In some years, I've just not done it at all because the conditions weren't right and we skipped to the year altogether. So far, there's nothing really showing us that there's anything to be worried about. As part of this same survey, we started collecting data on age structure, like Bernie's been showing for some of the other species, walleye and perch. We do the same thing with bass. These are cross-sections of the spines, the spiny dorsal rays on the back of the bass. We can see the rings on them like a tree trunk. And so we can take this for hundreds of fish and put it together and look at what the average size is for length, or the average age is for the size of a fish. And then we can project, these growth rates. So at X, age of 15-inch fish, is, 7, maybe 8 years old and all the way up. What you see here is a bunch of lakes inland as well as Lake Champlain. We do this on all of our inland waters, but we've just recently started doing it on Champlain. The blue line with the black, or the blue line with the squares on it is published literature showing the same information from across the whole country, compiled together to show what the average countrywide growth rate would be of largemouth and smallmouth bass. Why you see that a little bit higher on largemouth bass, because that's incorporating, the southern U.S. state data where they grow year-round. Our bass get about 4 months to grow before they stop growing and it gets cold again. Smallmouth bass, not so much, because they don't have smallmouth bass in the south, as much. So that data is not representative of southern U.S. growing seasons. All right, so the other thing we do, again, going back to the tournaments, I mentioned that we have a lot of clubs, that are, small local groups that come regionally and within the 2 states to fish. They're little small events, 10 boats, 20 boats on the lake. And we've started building a reporting program for them. So the data that they collected, their own little local events, gets turned into us as well. And so we can start monitoring their own catch. These are the anglers mostly that were, initiating the complaints about the pro anglers, years ago. So just as an example, this shows you how many bass tournaments we have on any given lake. This is from 2022. We had 111 bass-only tournaments on Lake Champlain being hosted on both sides of the lake, boat ramps on Vermont and New York side. That's a lot of pressure weekend after weekend. There's not a boat ramp, somewhere on the lake that doesn't have a tournament, starting when bass season opens to when it ends at the end of the year. So over time, we're going to start building this database as well as another way to keep monitoring that population. So one thing I just wanted to mention, because this is something repeated to me regularly in the last couple of years from bass anglers specifically, is they can't wait for gobies to get here. And I just wanted to mention that, there are threats to, maintaining this, quality bass fishery that we have on Lake Champlain beyond the tournament pressure that we've been seeing. And the big one right now is gobies. You probably heard about it. You've probably seen it in the news. They've been expanding their distribution through the Great Lakes, across western New York, through the Erie Mohawk Canal system, pretty steadily over, 20 years or more, to the point where they are now here in the watershed pretty much. They're in the Hudson River in Albany. They were found there 2 years ago, I think. So we're now basically bookended by populations of gobies. We have them now below the lock system, but in the Hudson River, below Lock C1, down in Albany. But they're also in the St. Lawrence River and the lower Richelieu River, which is the outlet of Lake Champlain. It all flows north into the St. Lawrence River through the Richelieu. So we have two potential areas. They've been in the St. Lawrence River for a long time, but the flow of water goes out. Harder for them to move up. They're not great swimmers. But eventually, one way or another, we're probably going to see them here unless something is done about that, and we're working on that cooperatively with New York, trying to address that from the south. Because once they get into the lock system, that flow completely changes, and they could get here quite soon. Why are we worried about it? Well, they do a lot of things. They reproduce extremely fast. Gobies spawn about every 20 days from April until October, and they build their numbers up really, really quickly to the point where there can be thousands and thousands per square meter of lake bottom, just blanketing the bottom. They also carry diseases. We know for a fact that gobies carry viral hemorrhagic septicemia, that big disease that was killing millions of fish in the Great Lakes in 2005, 2008, and it's still out there. And they're carrying that, through New York as they come towards us. They also, because of the way they blanket the bottom, they're going to impact many native fish species that we have most anglers aren't even aware of. Things like eastern sand darters and channel darters, which are state-listed, threatened and endangered species in Vermont. Our sculpin down here, log perch. These are benthic fish that live on the bottom, same places that gobies live. They eat little, insect life and things like that, make our lake healthy. Evidence shows that when gobies get into a lake, like they did in Lake Oneida, these fish basically disappear. Getting into the angler side of things, gobies are really good at eating fish eggs. They swarm the bottom, they go into the nest, they go into the spawning reefs of lake trout, they can get down in the little crevices, and they can wipe out entire year classes of fish under the right conditions, everything from bass to walleye to lake trout to sturgeon. So it's a concern to see these things heading our way. This is the part that makes me worried. I get anglers who have told me right to my face, over the last few years, they can't wait for gobies to get here. And this is why, because in places where gobies do exist right now in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River, the island, the area around the island of Montreal, are producing 6, 7, 8 pound smallmouth bass. There's no doubt that they're a new food source for some of these sport fish, and they're growing to huge proportions. But there's always a trade-off with that. You get bigger bass, but you get fewer bass because the reproduction just can't, sustain that. It's not a trade-off I think we should be willing to make. So it's something that, we have to really keep our eyes on. And other, state jurisdictions have done things as drastic as shut spring bass fishing down so that angling pressure doesn't also, add on to that loss of reproduction that the gobies are putting on the bass when they swarm the nests and eat the eggs. So that's something we're keeping our thumb on, still working on. But any questions about bass surveys in general?
That was a great introduction to invasive species in Lake Champlain, as well as the talk about white perch. Other species we're probably concerned about, we haven't mentioned yet, like tench and ruff already in the lake. But what I'm going to do is shift gears a little to the main lake of Lake Champlain and talk mostly a little down, farther in the food web, and discuss sort of planktonic invaders or major invaders to the main lake and what maybe some of those impacts have been. And I'll end this up with maybe what some of those impacts are on the fish community. And if I have time, I'll discuss climate change. Right now, I got to do what everyone else does and figure out how to make it go. So I'm going to talk about data from the Lake Champlain Long-Term Monitoring Program, funded by the EPA through the Lake Champlain Basin Program, operated through the states of New York and Vermont, both state agencies. And this is just all the river sites that are sampled. We went out and sampled rivers yesterday in the spring flow for the first time this year. And all these black dots are lake sites where the LTM work is done. You hear about phosphorus on Lake Champlain? These are the points at which that data is collected by LTM. This is the program that collects that chemistry data that we all use to manage phosphorus issues. In addition to that, the program actually collects plankton samples in the lake. So I'm going to talk a little about that and how that's documented a few invaders, and also some of the impacts of some of the invaders on the planktonic community. So this is our food web. A lot of fish in there, a lot of fish you just heard about in here. There's yellow perch, there's lake trout. The orange boxes are plankton, zooplankton. They're fed on largely by something called the mysid shrimp, which is a very good, important fish food. And then the green boxes are algae, phytoplankton, things you'll hear about, including the blue-green algae. I'll get back to that in a minute. What I really want to talk about is the four main invaders that have affected Lake Champlain in the last 30 some odd years. One of them is a fish, the alewife, which we've heard a little about. And we all have heard a little about the zebra mussel over the years. And then the two most recent ones, the spiny and fishhook water flea. So I'm just going to document a little of what the impacts of these invasions were. I'll probably stay away from the dynamics of how the invasions occurred, but I'll do that very quickly here. Zebra mussel, most likely through the Champlain Canal, South Lake. Alewife, we don't know. That one's up in the air. Spiny water flea was detected in the canal the same year it invaded, 1 lock away from Lake Champlain, but we don't know whether that was the actual source for it getting into the lake. Fishhook water flea, we have no idea how it invaded. It was in Lake Ontario, closest system before it was discovered in 2018 in Lake Champlain. My guess is a boat transfer. So let's just go right to some sort of what are these invaders doing in the lake. This blue line is the zebra mussel adult populations at the Burlington Harbor, the Burlington Boathouse, showing you when they invaded, when they expanded in the main lake, when their populations got high. And you can see here planktonic rotifers in Lake Champlain and how they dramatically declined upon the invasion of the zebra mussel into the lake. There's the correlation of those two data sets. If you look at the rotifers in Lake Champlain, this is one of our first papers out on the impact of zebra mussel. See a bunch of species of rotifers here, lots of them present in the 90s, many of them going away. Here's pictures of a few of them. And this fish scale looking one is called Conachilus, which I have a better picture here, is the one that wins the race among this. This is the smallest of the planktonic community in Lake Champlain, basically the opposite in size of fish. Conachilus is a gelatinous colonial rotifer. Zebra mussels reject it and spit it back out through the siphon. They do not want to feed on it, they reject it. So Conachilus wins in the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain when you throw zebra mussels into water and let them start filtering. And in the Great Lakes, we have the same story. The rest of the rotifer community, they really don't swim well. They're small particles. They're like small particles. They get filtered out by zebra mussels. So the first title of my first graduate student's paper here at SUNY Plattsburgh was, "Where have all the rotifers gone?" Because they disappeared. And you're talking about millions of organisms in a biomass that is higher than the total biomass of all the fish in the lake combined, basically declining by 90% in the matter of 3 to 4 years. So that has implications for the rest of the ecosystem and the food web, and ultimately maybe some translation up into the fishery. This is one of our also most recent papers with colleagues at UVM, where we show the dramatic decline in the top of that planktonic food web, the mysid shrimp. Also at the same time, we saw those rotifer declines and zebra mussel onset into the lake. This paper actually has data that goes back to the 70s that shows that there were very high densities even back to the 70s up here I gotta fix my time thing there. Around 1,000 individuals per cubic meter. And we've declined in the 90s. Our mysid populations crashed, concomitant with zebra mussel increase in the lake, and they've stayed low ever since. We have very little in the middle food web in terms of biomass energy here to support a forage fishery like a smelt fishery or now the alewife forage fish. And this is also, again, a pattern that we've seen in the other Great Lakes. When zebra mussels invade, mysis don't do well. So there's been some impacts on Lake Champlain. Let's move on to the next one. And this is actually data from the trial program, Bernie, that Vermont ran for years. This is the alewife abundance. Again, the line on here, the red line is the mysid, just to give you that reference for the mysid crash. Alewife invaded the lake around the time frame of 2004 to 2006. You can see from that trawl survey where the abundances in the lake rose dramatically between 2006 and 2010. They're still there. They've gone up and down in abundance since then. But this shows the next major invader to the main lake system of Lake Champlain was this fish around almost 20 years, actually 15 to 20 years since the zebra mussel invasion. We know a little more. I'm not going to talk extensively about the impacts of this, but we do know some of the impacts of this on plankton. This shows some trend lines for you. Again, mysids are there in red, rotifers are there, but now I've got other plankton in these other dashed lines, showing you a little bit of how some of the other plankton responded to the alewife invasion. And the basic conclusion there is summarized on this slide, which is the smaller bodied zooplankton showed some changes in patterns in population levels upon the alewife invasion. And we also saw a change in body size among the plankton. Alewife feeds like a vacuum cleaner, and it crops things off above about 900 microns in size. So all the large plankton that's big gets sucked up by an alewife and eaten, and the smaller bodied plankton then gets a release from that potential competitors, and they can do a little bit better. And the zebra mussel decline hammered the rotifers and hammered the mysids. So back to the food web briefly. We have the zebra mussels in the 90s over here impacting rotifers. We have the alewife coming in the mid 2000s, impacting other parts of the zooplanktonic community. We've had this mysid decline that's associated with the events of the 90s. I used to end the invasive talk on Lake Champlain right there. And I would have an impassioned plea about how we should prevent the future invasion of some of our biggest threats coming. That includes the goby right now, on the deck to invade Lake Champlain. I have to change this talk. This is one of the worst things I have to do in my entire career, is now tell you about the invasion of the fishhook and spiny water flea into Lake Champlain, both of which I believe we could have prevented. So this is the bad part of the talk, for me at least, tough to get through. This is again that mysid decline on the graph for you, showing 92 to mid 2000s. And there's the explosion of the spiny water flea, Bithotrephes, invaded Lake Champlain in 2014. It was at its closest point in the canal just south of the lake that same year, was in Lake George for 3 or 4 years. Lake George drains directly into Lake Champlain, and was in 8 or 9 or 10 other Adirondack lakes between 2008 and this 2014, when in 2008 it invaded Sacandaga Lake, which was its first known occurrence really west of the Finger Lakes, east of the Finger Lakes in New York State. So I'm going to show you a couple quick maps documenting that invasion. The left panel is August 2014, a sample at all 15 of the monitoring sites, no detection of anything. And that panel goes back 5 years prior to that. Every sample, no spiny water flea, no fishhook. It's a clean lake. We have no invaders of these species. We detected a few specimens in 2 sites in August 2014. Within 2 weeks, they expanded throughout the entire lake to extremely high abundances. This species is like a flea, or like a termite in your house. It colonizes, it can reproduce asexually through something called parthenogenesis, which means the female produces eggs without sexual reproduction. There's a brood of 4 on the back of a female. Within 2 weeks, you can expand your population so dramatically that you get to numbers that actually are higher than numbers we've seen in most of the Great Lakes. And they took over Lake Champlain in a matter of less than a month. So there they are. That's the student that sent me the picture from the lab on one of the first, we had been doing this sampling for a long time, and it's easy to do them because there was nothing in them. And this was Gabrielle, who sent me this and said, do I have to count this sample? Those are all spiny water flea. There were several hundred there in a sample. We had not encountered this ever. It surprised all of us, including me as a biologist who you'd think would have known what would be happening. I said when we first found a few, oh, it'll be several years before we see them lake-wide. No, it happened fast. Unfortunately, it's the same story for this next invader that really has hammered the main lake of Lake Champlain. In 2018, our monitoring program, we've been collecting the samples, for years. We do it as part of LTM. My student, Zach Cutter, who you're going to see some data from his work on this in a minute, came to me and showed me this specimen at the scope. Mark Malkoff looked at it as well. That's a fishhook water flea. That's what I said when I looked at the scope. And I said, oh my God, that's not a spiny. We all confirmed it, that it was a fishhook. And sure enough, we documented the first evidence of that species in Lake Champlain. This only known presence of this fish was in the Finger Lakes and Lake Ontario. So someone on a boat brought this from that far. Again, a clean map for this species for years. And you can see all the sites in Lake Champlain there. And then boom, we get it in a couple sites. 2 weeks later, it's lake-wide. Those bubbles are extremely high abundances for this species. This one has been around since 2018, still here in high abundance. If you troll for lake trout, you see this wadded up on your fishing line. It looks like a cotton ball because the spines get caught on the fishing line. It's a heavy nuisance if you fish. It also has a pretty big impact on the ecosystem. So I'll just do one quick review of Zach Cutter's master's thesis work, which was about these two invaders and their impact on the lower planktonic food web of the lake. This is one graph from his paper manuscript we just finished last week. It's going out for publication. And the main point here is when this is pre-invasion. All these bubbles are the densities of this species, Daphnia retrocurva, our single most abundant cladoceran in the lake. This is the main food item for forage fish. Smelt are going to eat this thing like crazy. It's pretty good abundances. This is before invasion. This is after, and look where the spiny water flea densities are high over here, and Daphnia retrocurva is gone. Its population crashed in the presence of this massive predator that came in and basically ate them. And the literature in the Great Lakes shows that this is a really slow-swimming plankton species, easy to catch for these invaders, and we had population crashes of this, our most abundant plankton in Lake Champlain, within that 2-week period of the invasion of the species. So I won't get into the rest of even the fishhook story, which is also a fairly complicated community story, other than to just point out that we have this sort of, I'll get into sort of those 4 species and what they've done to the food web by simplifying the food web down here a little bit. And you have the zebra mussel and the alewife, which I just told you about. And you bring in those other 2 species in 14 and 18, they hammer the other end of the food web with copepods, cladocerans, the more larger bodied planktonic organisms. Potentially provide, and we don't know the answer to this is a question we need to address, are these food items for alewife or smelt? What are they doing to energy flow up through the food web that might translate into trout and salmon food web relationships? Good question. Are these potentially going to increase the available energy for salmon or trout? We don't know the answer to that either. So we're working on those questions, which is really, we've had big changes in the lower planktonic food web. They've been very dramatic and massive. Started with the zebra mussel nailing all the rotifers in the lake. Now the fishhook and spiny water flea are literally just taking out that middle of the food web in the lake. We have the alewife as well, a major dominant player in the middle of the food web. There's a paper out that Bernie's involved in that addresses the alewife and smelt issues and how that invasion has affected smelt. We have big questions about how now smelt is getting its energy from its forage base, from the planktonic forage base, and then how that might lead to perch, salmon, lake trout dynamics. We don't know the answers to a lot of the upper food web questions going on here. But what we do know is those 4 major invasions in the lake have had a really big effect on the middle planktonic food web in the lake. and that has to have implications for the rest of the food web. So sad story to some extent. Along the way, we had written a few things up for other audiences. We wrote a couple books for children. These were actually done before the invasions. The first one was my students in the lab said, hey, I think it'd be really cool if we wrote a children's book. So we did. We titled it Captain Fishhook Water Flea. We got that wrong because the spiny invaded first. And then the second one was sort of the next version of that. And still, even at that point, the spiny water flea hadn't invaded when we did this one. And we had to rewrite the end of this book because right about the time this book was finished was that August 2014 when fishhook invaded. And so in this book, at the end of the spiny water flea does get to invade. It's called His Revenge, unfortunately. Got to do a third book now, I guess, on the fishhook invasion because Captain Fishhook is here too. I'll do one last quick slide and then I want to just run through some climate change sort of implications for the lake, I think which have a lot to do with trends and patterns we've been seeing in lots of things. And that is to convince you the importance of plankton. Oops, okay. Okay, can I do this one first? All right. So why is plankton important? This is one of my grad students who did this. Flathead Lake, Montana has bald eagles and bears. It has a pretty good salmon fishery, has a pretty good plankton community. Then they got this invader. For them, it's the mysid, the opossum shrimp, which is native to us in Lake Champlain. That invader came in, wreaked havoc on the food web, wreaked havoc on the fish community, caused problems then with bald eagle and bear populations. So my grad student did this slide at the end of her defense a couple of years ago, Erin Hayes-Pontius. And what she said at the end of this was, if you don't care about plankton, you don't care about America. And we'll leave it at that. We can talk about climate change later.
Where we want to go, and also reaches out to trying to figure out how we can get angler help as things move forward. So I'm gonna kind of have to wing the survey a little bit because I only saw the presentation a couple hours ago, pretty much in full. So start off with some basic background and purpose. The Lake Champlain Fish and Wildlife Management Cooperative stocks salmon. We've been doing that for many years now. We have certain criteria and conditions we're looking for. Already kind of mentioned in some of the information about the strategic plan and our goals and objectives. Establish and maintain a recreational fishery and restore naturally reproducing populations. And currently we assess some of the recreational fisheries by things like the LCI Derby. We utilize some of that data for our indicators and our scorecards. We've done creel surveys on the lake. Creel surveys tend to be fairly expensive, large scale. It's a big lake to deal with. And then we had in the past done some stuff with an angler diary program. We remember there were little books we'd hand out to people. We'd get them mailed back in and enter some of that data in. That angler program was a voluntary and required basically anglers provide information about their trip and their catch. That program was ran from 1977 to 2018. It was discontinued because as time went on, the number of participants went down. It just kept going down and down and down. And then there was a lot of issues with incomplete data. There's some basic parts and amount of information we need to have in that angler diary to actually make it useful for us to look at things like catch rates and then some data entry constraints. So that was kind of, that program was phased out. While it was phased out, we still had some additional discussions about our strategic plan, and we still brought in these concerns and values of trying to get a measure on some of the angler catch rates and interest. So we have these different factors we're still trying to gather that information on. And then we engaged through talking with some of the anglers, a desire by the anglers groups to kind of restart some of these programs. So with the hope to be able to address some of these concerns about, working on getting more samples for our parental tagging program, working to get some catch information about lake trout, and kind of also being an opportunity for awareness and communication about invasive species and between the anglers and the managers. So we asked the question last year, I think at the same State of the Lake. We introduced the concept. We had an online survey to collect information about interest. We want to make sure before we start this and try to get things going that there's enough angler interest that we're going to get that. So we did have that last year, and as a result of those meetings, we started to that. We got together enough people. There was 110 response that were in favor of that. We looked at that, and one part that was brought up was that a lot of people preferred something different than those paper versions. Those paper versions have a lot of challenges. We have to enter the data after we get the data. You have to keep this paper book and a pencil on the boat. With the digital form, the idea is that the angler's entering the information right into the database, and it's already done at that. And we can also put some conditions on that database to kind of help guide and make sure the right information is being recorded and we're getting all those key pieces done. And we seem to have that high participation. We had an interest that we had enough people that are doing at least 5 trips per year. So that's where we started to develop this new angler diary. We went with a web-based version using a Survey 123 and looked at trying to reach some of these objectives. We're looking at catch rates for salmon, lake trout, brown trout, and steelhead. We're going to basically use that for assessing some of our stocking strategies. We can compare some fisheries independent, so the data from our fall surveys or summer surveys to the angler diary, because often those data are a little different. We have to look at that carefully. We can also assess with the diary angler satisfaction. And then again, to kind of reestablish and continue that dialogue. I can't talk. Basically, our communication with the angling public. Yeah. So where are we on the status? We had in the fall, we had a beta version go out. We had a few anglers we were working with. We had a really low response rate. I don't think we had one entry from that group of people we were working with. So a little bit disheartening that we weren't having some more of that from those people that were asking for it. And now we're at the point where we're having this meeting here. We're looking to do another second round of beta testing. We have had some recent discussions with some anglers and are working to adjust the application a little bit to make it a little easier to enter, a little bit address some issues that were brought up through some of that testing. So I put up on the desk up there's a sign-up sheet. It probably now is a full page. We've gone to like page 12, right, of that for sign-ups. For anyone that wants to get involved in that, we're collecting emails or some sort of contact information for you so we can work on doing another round of beta testing. Ice is going away. People are getting out in the lake. We want to try to get some of that data. So we're hoping to finalize those adjustments and get that out fairly soon for a targeted release and then see where we can go from there. And then kind of what is needed is what we wanted is really your help to get that kind of pulled together, get your involvement in that as it can be a useful tool for our management of salmonids on the lake.